Just a moment, we'll take you live to the floor of the House of Representatives, where Jim Chalmers will deliver his third budget as Treasurer. It's perhaps his most important. You can hear the bells go summoning the House together. Tonight, the Albanese government is attempting to provide much-needed cost of living relief, while at the same time not going too far and adding to inflation. It's a delicate balance, and we're about to discover how the Treasurer plans to strike it. And with a federal election due in the next 12 months, the stakes are high. Immediately after the speech, Sarah Ferguson will present a special edition of 7:30, including the first post-budget interview with the Treasurer. And later, more analysis with David Spears and a midweek edition of Insiders. For now, let's take you live to the House of Representatives and the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
I have received a message from His Excellency the Governor-General recommending, in accordance with Section 56 of the Constitution, an appropriation for the purposes of the Appropriation Bill No. 1, 2024 to 2025. I call the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I present the Appropriation Bill No. 1, 2024-25 and the explanatory memorandum.
And I call the Clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to appropriate money out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for expenditure out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the ordinary annual services of the government and for related purposes.
And I call the Treasurer.
Thank you, Speaker. I move that the bill be now read a second time. And on this Ngunnawal land, I acknowledge all of the First Nations people of this country and the custodians, customs and cultures which guide and inspire us. Mr Speaker, this is a budget for the here and now, and it's a budget for the decades to come. It's a responsible budget that helps people under pressure today and invests in the promise and potential of the more prosperous future that we can make together. Our main priorities are helping with the cost of living, building more homes for Australians, investing in a future made in Australia and the skills and universities we'll need to make it a reality, strengthening Medicare and the care economy, and responsible economic management which is set to produce another surplus and help fight inflation. Speaker, this government and this budget delivers for every Australian. A tax cut for every taxpayer, wages growing in every industry, a better deal for every working parent, a fairer go at every checkout, new help with energy bills for every household and for small business, stronger Medicare in every community, more homes in every state and territory, more opportunities in every TAFE and university, a dignified retirement for older Australians, energy and industry policies that help bring the jobs of the future to every corner of our country, an economic plan where growth and opportunity go together, a government and a budget for every Australian. This budget is framed in fraught and fragile global conditions. The world economy is resilient in parts but subdued overall. Inflation is lingering in North America, growth is slowing in China and tepid in Europe. Tensions have escalated in the Middle East and they persist in Ukraine. Global supply chains are fragmenting. This uncertainty combines with cost of living pressures and higher interest rates to slow our economy, with growth forecast to be just 1.75% this financial year and 2% next. Slower growth means a softer labour market, with unemployment expected to rise slightly to 4.5% next year, even as we create tens of thousands of new jobs. I want Australians to know that despite everything coming at us, we are among the best placed economies to manage these uncertainties and maximise our opportunities. We have an envied combination of moderating inflation, record new jobs, near record participation, real wages growth, the lowest ever gender pay gap, and expanding business investment. Annual inflation has more than halved from its peak in 2022, and it's now lower than anticipated in the mid-year update. But we know that people are still under the pump. That's why we designed our cost of living policies to ease these pressures and take another 0.75 of a percentage point off inflation this year and 0.5 percentage point next year. Treasury is now forecasting that inflation could return to target earlier, perhaps even by the end of this year. At the same time, around 780,000 jobs have been created under this government, a record for any first term. This is stronger jobs growth than in any major advanced economy. Real wages are growing again for the first time in almost 3 years. Business investment is now expected to record its longest annual expansion since the mining boom. And we're addressing the pressures caused by population growth, with net overseas migration next year now expected to be half what it was last year. Speaker, the number one priority of this government and this budget is helping Australians with the cost of living. Responsible relief that eases pressure on people and directly reduces inflation. The comprehensive cost of living plan in this budget delivers a tax cut for every taxpayer, provides new power bill relief for people and small businesses. It freezes the cost of medicines. It makes student loans fairer. It boosts competition in our economy so families and farmers get a fairer deal. And it supports renters as well. Our new tax cuts for Middle Australia are the biggest part of the cost of living relief in this budget. From July 1, all 13.6 million taxpayers will get a tax cut. And for 84% of taxpayers and 90% of tax-paying women, a bigger tax cut than they would have under the previous government. This is about rewarding the hard work of our nurses and teachers and truckies and tradies, and the 2.9 million people earning $45,000 a year or less who would have received nothing. The average benefit is $1,888 a year, which is $36 a week. Our tax cuts are better for families and communities, women and young people. They are better for business and they are better for the economy. Speaker, in 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered the biggest shock to global energy prices since the 1970s. We know Australian families and businesses have felt this pain, and that's why we've stepped in to help. Electricity prices would have risen 15% in the last year, if not for our efforts. Instead, they rose an average of 2%. And tonight, I assure Australians that more help is on the way. This budget delivers $3.5 billion in new energy bill relief for everyone. Just as every Australian taxpayer will get a tax cut, every Australian household will get energy price relief. From July 1, Australians will receive an energy rebate of $300 and 1 million small businesses will get a little bit more. The ABS has shown how cutting energy bills directly cuts inflation too, keeping the lights on for families and businesses and keeping downward pressure on inflation. Mr Speaker, Labor governments make Medicare stronger and we make medicines cheaper. We're providing up to $3 billion for cheaper medicines and the community pharmacies that distribute them. And we are freezing the maximum cost of PBS prescriptions for everyone. This year and next year, no one will pay more than $31.60. But 6 out of 10 PBS scripts go to pensioners and concession card holders. And we will freeze the cost of their medicines for 5 years, meaning no pensioner, no concession card holder will pay more than $7.70 for the medicine that they need. We're also investing $3.4 billion to add life-changing and life-saving medicines to the PBS, cutting the cost of one breast cancer treatment from around $100,000 to $31.60. Mr Speaker, going to university can be a life-changing opportunity. For 35 years now, our student loan system has supported millions of people who study hard to chase their dream. But spikes in inflation have exposed a flaw in this system and put young people under unfair pressure. We are fixing that and we're changing that so that it won't happen again. We're capping indexation of student loans to either the consumer price index or the wage price index, whichever is lower. And backdating it to the middle of 2023 will cut indexation from last year in half. It will wipe $3 billion in student debt for over 3 million Australians and save the average person around $1,200. Speaker, we know that Australians are feeling the pinch at the checkout. That's why we empowered the competition watchdog to hold supermarkets accountable. That's why we're taking steps to make the food and grocery code mandatory and making our economy more competitive across the board by strengthening the mergers regime and abolishing nuisance tariffs and reducing compliance costs for business. Because more competition means more choices, it means lower prices and better services and better jobs. Now, rising rents, Mr Speaker, are another big part of the inflation challenge, and we're supporting renters who need our help. We are providing $1.9 billion to increase the maximum rates of Commonwealth rent assistance by a further 10%. Yeah. This is on top of the 15% increase delivered in our last budget. It's the first back-to-back increase to Commonwealth rent assistance in more than 30 years, and more much-needed help for young people and for renters of all ages doing it tough. So we're easing the cost of living and we are building more homes for Australians. In the 5 years from this July, we aim to build 1.2 million of them. Our goal is ambitious, but it's achievable if we all work together and if we all do our bit. $6.2 billion in new investments mean our $32 billion Homes for Australia plan will clear local infrastructure bottlenecks, provide more housing for students, fund more social and affordable housing, and we'll also deliver better transport for better access to suburbs and cities and regions. Mr Speaker, more homes means more affordable homes and a better deal for buyers, builders and renters alike. The current housing pipeline is backed up. We've already allocated $3.5 billion to address bottlenecks and to slash red tape. And this budget includes another $1 billion to help states and territories build more housing sooner. And we're providing $89 million for 20,000 additional fee-free TAFE and vet and vocational places to train more construction workers to do the work that we will need. Yeah. Speaker, Australia's international education sector is a national asset, but for too long enrolments have grown without being matched by an increase in student housing supply. This puts pressure on prices and rents, especially in our cities and suburbs. It makes finding housing harder for everyone. We have a more substantial and a more sustainable approach. If universities want to take more international students, they must build more student accommodation. We will limit how many international students can be enrolled by each university based on a formula, including how much housing they build. So more student housing and more social housing. Tonight's budget delivers an additional $1.9 billion in loans to help build 40,000 social and affordable homes. We've also secured the National Housing Agreement, which would otherwise have run out. We're building more remote housing in the Northern Territory. We're doubling funding dedicated to addressing homelessness. And we're directing $1 billion towards accommodation for women and children fleeing domestic violence and for youth. Building new homes will mean building new connections to community as well, so people can find good jobs and count on reliable transport close to where they want to live. We're investing in vital projects to build new transport networks across every state and territory, including a new rail link that will bring the communities of the Sunshine Coast and Brisbane together. Opening Western Sydney to the world with $2.3 billion for better infrastructure and the new international airport, and $102 million to upgrade regional airports and remote airstrips, better connecting remote communities to essential services. Mr Speaker, we're building more homes and we're helping people now. And we're also building an economy that will position our people to benefit from the opportunities of the decades ahead. The world is committed to net zero by 2050. This will demand the biggest transformation in the global economy since the Industrial Revolution. Australian energy can power it. Australian resources can build it. Australia's regions can drive it. Australian researchers can shape it. And Australian workers can thrive in it. Our $22.7 billion Future Made in Australia package will help make us an indispensable part of the global net zero economy, a crucial part of a growth agenda which is all about attracting investment in key industries, making our country a renewable energy superpower, strengthening our defence capabilities and our economic security, supporting small business to grasp the opportunities of our transforming economy, and expanding and reforming tertiary education for a more skilled workforce. To realise the opportunities of a future made in Australia, we're changing the way that we attract and deploy investment in our economy. A new Act and a new framework will impose the rigour, focusing investment on transformational opportunities and setting conditions to ensure investors benefiting from our incentives are supporting their people and communities to lift private investment in skills and workers and workforces and local supply chains. We will create a front door for investors to accelerate and coordinate transformational projects, establish a domestic national interest account that adds discipline to investments in the national interest, and strengthen and streamline approvals across environmental, planning, cultural heritage and foreign investment. We know that the global energy transformation presents a golden opportunity for Australia. The world is changing and the pace of that change is accelerating, and our approach to growth and investment needs to change as well. If we hang back, the chance for a new generation of jobs and prosperity will pass us by, and our people will be poorer and our economy will be more vulnerable as a consequence. This budget invests in our renewable energy superpower ambitions, including $13.7 billion in production tax incentives for green hydrogen and processed critical minerals, so industries are rewarded for scale and success. The $1.7 billion Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund to develop new industries like green metals and low-carbon fuels, and $520 million to deepen net zero trade and engagement with our region. We're also allocating $566 million to map the geological potential of our entire country, to get a comprehensive picture of our critical minerals and our groundwater as well. Speaker, in a world of rapid economic change and heightened strategic competition, investing in modern defence industries serves our economic and national security interests. That's why we're injecting $50.3 billion over the decade to deliver the capabilities we need to keep Australians safe as part of the National Defence Strategy. We're also boosting economic resilience and strengthening our supply chains, giving Australian firms the chance to manufacture more of the next generation of solar panels, moving our nation along the critical minerals value chain through investing in battery production and backing the Australian creators of the world's first commercial-scale quantum computer. In defence, in energy, in resources and right around our economy, we want Australian small businesses to share in the big opportunities ahead as well. That's why we're extending the $20,000 instant asset write-off until 30 June 2025, providing $290 million in cash flow support for up to 4 million small businesses, and investing $625 million to help farmers and rural communities reduce emissions and better prepare for climate change and drought. Speaker, to seize the transformative opportunities of a more modern economy, we will expand the opportunity and reach of tertiary education to more Australians in response to the Universities Accord. Because it shouldn't matter whether you live in the suburbs or the regions, whether your parents are rich or poor, whether you were born with disability or grew up with disadvantage, whether you're a First Nations Australian or a first-generation Australian. The chance and the choice to go to university or TAFE should not be out of reach. Tonight we are setting a national target of 8 out of 10 workers achieving a tertiary qualification by 2050, and we're backing it in with new funding reforms to meet this goal. We're investing $350 million for fee-free uni-ready courses. These courses give those who would have missed out on studying a degree a foot in the door. And we're paying students in critical sectors like nursing and teaching and social work to do the practical placements which are such an important part of their studies. We're also investing $500 million in skills for priority industries like clean energy and construction and manufacturing, and supporting women to build careers in these fields. These landmark reforms will improve the quality, the affordability and the sustainability of the tertiary education system and drive lasting, transformative change for our students and for our economy. Mr. Speaker, one of the best and one of the most important things about our country is the way that we look out for each other and look after each other. Our health system and our care economy are central to this. That's why in this budget we are strengthening Medicare and mental health, delivering better, stronger aged care, making the NDIS fairer and more sustainable, and boosting wages in the care economy. The purpose and promise of Medicare is world-class health care every Australian can access and afford. And the foundation of that is bulk billing. Bulk billing GPs in family medical centres and bulk billing consultations in our new Medicare urgent care clinics. Since June last year, almost 400,000 visits have been made to our 58 clinics in suburbs and regions all over Australia. Almost 1 in 3 visits have been for kids under 15. And because these clinics open early and they close late, more than 1 in 3 visits were outside normal working hours. In this budget, we're allocating $227 million for a further 29 Medicare urgent care clinics, taking pressure off emergency departments and making it easier for Australians to access free healthcare. Making Medicare stronger also means doing better on mental health. That's why we're investing $361 million to strengthen our mental health system, including new funding for a national digital mental health service that will provide free support to 150,000 Australians a year. Speaker, as more Australians live longer and healthier lives, demand for our aged care services is growing and the sort of care we need is changing. We will invest another $2.2 billion in aged care and we will implement more of the Royal Commission, including $1.2 billion to improve systems so our aged care services remain accessible, up-to-date and reliable. Ensuring dignity and security for older Australians means allowing people to choose the care that's right for them, including staying in their own home. And that's why we're investing $531 million for another 24,000 home care packages, giving more Australians that choice. Now, whether it's aged care or the National Disability Insurance Scheme, we will work with the community and across this parliament to fund the future services that people need and deserve. Over the last decade, the NDIS has delivered life-changing support for Australians with a disability. All of us in this place take pride in it, and all of us must take responsibility for securing its future. Working with National Cabinet to put participants at the centre of the scheme and design and fund additional foundational supports outside of it, and ensuring that every dollar invested in the NDIS goes to those who need it most, which is why we're providing $469 million to keep working with the disability community and the states and territories to crack down on fraud and exploitation. Speaker, this government is ensuring that Australians can earn more and keep more of what they earn in the care economy and in every industry. We will ensure that those who look after our kids and teach our kids as they learn and our parents as they age have the secure, well-paid jobs that they deserve. We will fund a further increase in award wages for our aged care workers, building on the $11.3 billion that we funded last year. And we have provision for a wage increase for childcare workers and early educators as well. Yeah. This will help recruit and retain more early childhood educators, giving more Australian kids the best start that we can. Speaker, in childcare, in aged care and across the care economy, the majority of workers are women. Lifting wages in these industries has helped bring the gender pay gap to a historic low. Our government is the first in history with more than 50% women. and we are 100% committed to women's equality and opportunity and safety. Violence against women is a national shame and it requires our national action. We're delivering $925 million to establish the Permanent Leaving Violence program, which takes our total investment to address violence against women to $3.4 billion. But we know that there is more work for all of us to do. And we are very proud, Mr Speaker, that this budget extends superannuation to parents on paid leave. When it comes to these first months of your child's life, you can't put a price on being there, and you shouldn't pay a price for being there. That's why we've provided $1.1 billion to pay super on government-funded parental leave. This will make the super system fairer, it will reduce the gender gap, and it will benefit 180,000 families a year. And we're providing another $56 million to improve access to women's health services and $19 million to support carers to better choose how and when they work. Mr Speaker, we know that cost of living pressures fall heaviest on the most vulnerable. New energy rebates and more rent assistance will help. But we're also continuing the freeze on social security deeming rates until 30 June 2025, benefiting over 870,000 people, including 450,000 aged pensioners. For those who face additional barriers to finding work, we're providing $41 million to further extend eligibility for the existing higher rate of job seeker. So people who can only work up to 14 hours a week will see their payment increase at least $54.90 a fortnight. We will also make new investments in health and housing, education and jobs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As well as more remote housing, we're creating the new Remote Jobs and Economic Development program, with 3,000 new jobs in remote Australia to build new skills and new confidence within communities. So, Mr Speaker, from delivering a tax cut to every taxpayer to reducing student debt or helping renters, from new energy bill relief to the care economy to a future made in Australia, we are easing pressure on Australians while investing in our people, our economy and our future, at the same time as we strengthen the budget and pay down debt. Last year, our responsible economic management delivered the first surplus in 15 years. We now expect another surplus of $9.3 billion this year. Yeah. These would be the first back-to-back surpluses in almost 2 decades. But pressures on the budget intensify after that rather than ease. We're expecting a deficit of $28.3 billion in 24-25, but a stronger fiscal outcome in every year compared to when we came to government. Yeah. On our watch, the budget is $215 billion stronger over the 6 years to 2027-28. Gross debt is now expected to peak at 35.2% of our economy in 26-27 before declining to 30.2% by 2034-35. This year, gross debt will be $904 billion instead of the more than $1 trillion that we inherited. And that means debt is $152 billion lower. A stronger budget means we save around $80 billion in interest costs over the decade. These are the dividends of our responsible economic management. We've found $27.9 billion in savings and reprioritisations in this budget and $77.4 billion since the election. We're limiting real spending growth to an average of 1.4% per year since we came to government. That's less than half the average of the last 30 years, and it's around a third of the growth under our predecessors. And we're banking 96% of revenue upgrades this year, keeping pressure off inflation while it's still above the band, with Treasury now expecting we could get back to the inflation target this year, not next. That means inflation is expected to be lower sooner. And we've achieved all of this despite much smaller revenue upgrades in the budget and still providing an extra $3 billion to ensure Australians, including our veterans, receive better essential services. Yeah. So, Mr Speaker, the story of Australia is more than a tale of the challenges that we have endured. And in our future, we need to strive for something more than muddling through or making do. This budget shows that we are realistic about the pressures that people face right now, and we are optimistic about the future. This budget reflects our biggest ambitions and our highest aspirations to make Australians the primary beneficiaries of a world of churn and change, tapping their confidence, their compassion, their creativity, to manage their pressures and maximise our advantages, to forge a new economy and a new generation of prosperity. And in that effort, to make Australians and Australia more secure in the bigger opportunities that we shape and in the future that we make together. And that's why I commend this bill, Mr Speaker, and this budget to the House.
That was the Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivering his third budget. Hello, I'm Sarah Ferguson and welcome to this special edition of 7:30. In a moment, the Treasurer will begin to make his way to the 7:30 studio for his first post-budget interview, and later you'll hear from the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor for the opposition's response. Jim Chalmers has tonight forecast Labor's second surplus in as many years, with cost of living relief for every household in the form of energy bill rebates. But he's still confident inflation will come down. Spending, however, is set to rise as the government seeks to reshape the economy for the net zero transition with its Future Made in Australia plan. Here's National Affairs Editor Melissa Clark.
Striding into the fray, the Treasurer has handed down his third budget, promising the economy is turning a corner, with inflation settling and financial help on offer. There's energy bill relief and income tax cuts across the board.
Why are you giving it to everyone and not targeting it people who really need it the most?
We need to recognise that these cost of living pressures don't begin and end with people on fixed incomes. There are a lot of people doing it tough in Middle Australia as well.
Rising costs have been the big challenge, forcing up interest rates and wiping out people's spending power. But now the federal government is confident the end is in sight. After peaking at 7.8%, inflation is due to come down to under 3% by the end of the year and stay at 2.75% for a few more years. Wages are forecast to rise either 0.5% or a full percentage point higher than inflation, meaning a small but steady increase in real wages, a welcome change from recent years. But right now, the rising cost of living is still biting, so the government is spending money to help households save. There's $3.5 billion in power bill relief for everyone. From July, rebates of $300 will be available to all households and $325 for around 1 million small businesses. It's not as much as was offered last year, but this time no one misses out. Rental prices have been one of the biggest causes of hip pocket pain, so there's more help on offer. The maximum rates of Commonwealth rent assistance will increase 10%. It's expected this will help nearly 1 million households. Combined with last year's boost, it will give renters as much as $70 extra each fortnight. But the biggest help will be the rejigged Stage 3 income tax cuts, which will see extra money in the pockets of nearly 14 million taxpayers. That means an average tax cut of $1,900 starting July 1. One of the biggest savings measures in the budget comes from the NDIS. A new compliance crackdown will save $14.4 billion. But that's only enough to cancel out the $14.4 billion in fresh cost blowouts to the scheme.
It's a responsible budget which eases cost of living, fights inflation and makes really important investments in the future of our economy. It is equal parts relief, restraint and reform.
The government is buoyed by delivering its second surplus in a row, the first in nearly 2 decades. But while the government is in the black this financial year, its deficits every year after that, worth $122 billion over the next 4 years. It's not just the cash balance that's looking worse for wear in the years ahead. Economic growth has been downgraded and won't rise above 2.5% for another 4 years. That's well below our major trading partners. But the budget notes the risk that conflict in the Middle East and Europe could change all of that. The Albanese government's big plan to shift the economy is to focus on the world's clean energy transition and the manufacturing opportunities it brings. It's been dubbed Future Made in Australia. The $22.7 billion package will cover a range of schemes over the next 10 years. The top priorities are tax incentives for critical minerals needed for clean energy, worth $7 billion, and a similar tax incentive for hydrogen production. That's another $6.7 billion. But the money won't be available until 2027.
It's all about making our economy more productive, more dynamic, more competitive, so that we can make our country and our people more prosperous into the future.
Forecasts, predictions and hopes bundled up in the budget papers.
So what are the political and economic consequences of the budget? Here's Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle.
We have got to see tonight just why the Albanese government has been providing such a steady stream of budget announcements over the past fortnight. It is not just that they were trying to maximise the coverage of individual measures by spreading them out, but that they wanted the notoriously short-term focus of journalists to be firmly on just two ideas on budget night. The first one is the cost of living. The second is the government's still a little vague but pretty expensive Future Made in Australia initiative. There's lots of references in Jim Chalmers' speech to the fact that everyone will benefit from its cost of living measures, which includes things like more rental assistance for those on low incomes, a freeze in the cost of medicines, and the already announced changes to student loan indexation. But most significantly, on top of the much-awaited tax cuts, every household, not just those on income support and low incomes, will this year get a $300 rebate on their energy costs, delivered in 4 quarterly instalments announced when their electricity bill arrives. But there is much more invested in this relatively small $3.5 billion over 2 years budget measure than the dollars alone. Much of the budget's promise of appeasing an angry electorate struggling with immense cost of living pressures hangs on the mechanical impact this subsidy will have on the measured inflation rate. Treasurer Jim Chalmers is backing the Treasury's forecast that this measure will spearhead policies which take 3/4 of a percentage point off inflation this year and 0.5 percentage point next year. As you have heard Chalmers tell Parliament just now, Treasury is now forecasting inflation could return to target earlier, perhaps even by the end of this year. Let's clarify that. The government is resting its economic credibility, and for that matter, much of its political future, on inflation falling to below 3% by Christmas. That puts it in the range of the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% target, and thus leaves the way open for the central bank to cut rates much earlier than it has been suggesting it would. Of course, that would mean it would be potentially cutting rates before an election, due to be held by about May next year. There was a time when economic management was driven heavily by the shape of the budget. All that talk about budget surpluses as a sign of good management, about the importance of budgets being back in the black. That is still important to the budget watchers, and Chalmers delivering 2 surpluses in a row is supposed to appease the demands for the budget not to be too expansionary, even if the forecast for the next few years shows a deterioration. But for the electorate in the Broad, the most conspicuous marker of good economic management after the last couple of years of punishing rate and price rises will come from the central bank, not the government, and its signal that rates may have at last peaked and are on their way down again. The risks in the strategy are significant. All sorts of shocks can hit the inflation number. And the picture of the economy painted in the budget papers is alarmingly weak. As the Treasurer said, the economic outlook is, quote, framed in fraught and fragile global conditions. Domestic economic growth of just 2% will be built on tepid household spending and big public sector spending continuing, including a very big spend on infrastructure. The second measure the government wants us to think about is the still a little vague but pretty expensive Future Made in Australia initiative, which promises to spend $22.7 billion over the next decade on an industrial transformation centred on renewable energy, a net zero future and shiny new areas like green hydrogen and critical minerals. The success of this policy is ultimately out of the hands of the government and reliant on business coming up with the net zero goods. Jim Chalmers' third budget doesn't feel like one where the Cabinet put a list together of disgruntled people or interest groups the government wanted to appease. Lots of interest groups will be very unhappy. There's not a lot of extra cost of living relief for those doing it the hardest, for example. And its two biggest punts on the inflation rate and the new economy are ultimately beyond the government's control. It is a budget that acknowledges it is facing a mountain of problems which just cannot be solved anytime soon, like housing. Given the focus on domestic violence in recent weeks, it's also hugely disappointing that there is no major injection of funds into providing frontline legal services for women fleeing violence, nor much for Indigenous communities. However, much of the structural change in the budget could well go unnoticed. In March, the government introduced legislation into the House of Representatives to start the task of addressing the blowouts and problems in the NDIS. It has only been revealed tonight that legislation will now be the budget's biggest saving, $14 billion worth over 4 years. But this will be churned back into the system in new payments of $15.9 billion. There are equally unsexy but crucial changes to other parts of the care economy, like aged care and the childcare workforce. The third Chalmers budget is one that is built on a hope that the government gets more time to fix the long-term problems, if it can just survive the political pressure from an electorate living on the financial edge for another year.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers said the biggest challenge he confronted putting this budget together was inflation. It loomed over all the decisions you're going to hear about tonight. The budget's success or failure in that regard will have profound consequences for the Albanese government's election prospects. The Treasurer has just finished his speech to the House and joins me now. Treasurer, welcome and congratulations on your budget.
Appreciate it.
Let's go straight to that question about inflation. You said, framing the budget, that it was the primary focus. Do you accept that if the RBA does raise rates post-budget, you'll be held to blame?
Oh, the Reserve Bank will take its decisions independently. I take responsibility for my part of the inflation fight, and the budget is making a big effort in that regard. This budget is about easing cost of living pressures. It's about putting downward pressure on inflation at the same time as we invest in the future.
I mean, the question was, if there is a change in the interest rates, and I know you're not making that decision, but will you accept then that this budget has failed to convince them?
I don't think that's the only measure of a decent budget. You know, we are trying to put downward pressure on inflation.
It would be a shattering verdict on this budget, though, wouldn't it?
Well, the Reserve Bank will take its decisions independently. I don't tell the Reserve Bank how to do its job, and then it doesn't tell me how to do my job. I'm very confident in this budget that we're putting downward pressure on inflation, that we are being part of the solution to inflation rather than the problem, and that's because of the spending restraint, the responsible economic management and the way we've designed our cost of living help.
All right, I'll come to the downward pressure in a moment, but just on one of those cost of living measures, which is the $300 that's going to every household in Australia, why do high-earning Australians need a subsidy?
Well, there are multiple parts of our cost of living package. There's a tax cut for every taxpayer and there's energy bill relief for every household. Those are the broad parts of our cost of living package. And then there are some targeted parts. Up to 1 million renters will get some help with medicine costs and in other ways as well. And that's because we recognise that a lot of people are under a lot of pressure. And because of this budget, more help is on the way. We've found a responsible and affordable but meaningful way to help people with the cost of living, not just people on low and fixed incomes, but people in Middle Australia too.
Yep, you talked about Middle Australia, but there's a whole bunch of people who aren't in Middle Australia, like yourself, who don't need help paying their bills. Why do you need to give energy relief to those people?
Well, first of all, I think these cost of living pressures go up and down the income scale. Yes, they fall disproportionately on the people on the lowest incomes and fixed incomes, and they are obviously our priority. But I think people are under the pump right around Australia.
Yes, but you will acknowledge there are people who are not under the pump. We hear about it a lot. The baby boomers, those people who've won the housing lottery and so on. Why are those people going to get $300 in their pocket?
Because I think these cost of living pressures are applying pretty broadly in our community. It doesn't make sense.
Even to the wealthy or the very wealthy?
Well, the simplest way to deliver this cost of living relief is via energy bills. Once you go beyond providing it to people who are on pensions and payments, who are our priority in the last budget, once you go beyond that, it makes sense to go broadly. Some of the cost of living package is broad. Every household gets energy bill relief. Every taxpayer gets a tax cut, and there's targeted cost of living help.
Yes, but you'd already done the tax cut, and here you are deciding to give extra money to wealthy people. I don't think you've yet explained why you're doing that, unless it's simply a matter of mechanism, but you're not arguing that.
Well, I think there are two things. The first point that I've made is that people are under cost of living pressure up and down the income scale.
Not at the top, though.
Well, and secondly, that it makes a lot of sense if you're providing this cost of living help the way that we are, to take the edge off energy bills and put downward pressure on inflation. Once you go beyond people on pensions and payments, the simplest, most efficient, most effective way is to provide it more broadly. That's part of the broad cost of living relief in the budget. There's targeted relief too.
So it's not just pre-election language that says relief for everybody. It's not just a slogan.
No, of course not. No, this is about putting people front and centre.
Even people who don't need it.
Well, it's about pressures on people right now, and it's about the priorities of the future. These are things that we care about, whether it's the third year of a term or the first year of a term. This budget is about the economic cycle, not the political cycle.
I think we haven't got an answer on why those people are getting that money, but let me move on to the question about
I think you have.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you, because I'm asking why it is you're choosing to give wealthy people $300.
Because cost of living pressures go up the income scale,
Not
and because
all the way.
it's the easiest, simplest, most efficient, most effective way to provide this help.
Let's talk about putting downward pressure on inflation. Now, conventional economic wisdom is that when governments put money in people's pockets, that money that we're just discussing, they will spend it. And that puts upward pressure on inflation. Why won't that happen this time?
Well, first of all, it's not a unanimous view of economists. It's very rare, in fact, to get a unanimous view.
No, but it's conventional
economists.
wisdom.
I'm not sure that it is. And the very clear advice that we got from Treasury was that by designing our cost of living package the way we have, we'll take the edge off inflation and we won't add to inflationary pressures elsewhere in the economy. We took that advice very seriously and we proceeded on that basis.
Well, have you found a magic formula that turns payments into households into an instrument to fight inflation? Because that would be a magic formula.
I don't think that people watching the program tonight would think it is anything other than common sense that if we take some of the edge off electricity bills and we take some of the edge off rents, that will put downward pressure on inflation. That's a very different thing to spraying around cheques or cash in the economy. It's taking the edge off bills. That's what we want to see. That's one of the reasons why we expect inflation to now moderate a bit faster than what we anticipated at Christmas.
Well, let's be clear about that, because what it does is it changes the number in the CPI, that is the basket of goods. So it changes that number. In that sense, it affects inflation, but it doesn't do anything to address supply and demand, the key thing that you must address when attacking inflation, which brings me back to my question. How does giving people money address demand?
Well, let's not overcomplicate it, Sarah.
I think that's a pretty straightforward thing. Inflation is about
let me give you a more
demand.
straightforward answer to that. If you take some of the edge off electricity bills and you take some of the edge off rents, of course inflation is going to go down. And what we've seen last budget, for example, because of our energy relief in the last budget, instead of energy prices going up 15% to March, they went up 2%. Rents are still too high, but they would have been even higher were it not for our rent assistance in the last budget. I think it's common sense, and that your viewers would understand if we're helping get the bills down for electricity and rent, then that will have a good impact on inflation.
It'll change those bills, it'll change the CPI, as I just said, but it won't change the demand in the economy, which is the number one thing that you're trying to stifle when fighting inflation. Am I right about that?
We have to look
or has inflation changed?
We have to look right across the budget. You know, we're showing spending restraint which would be unrecognisable to our predecessors. We're budgeting for a second surplus, which would be, if that happened, would be the first back-to-back surpluses in almost 2 decades.
And
we're showing
net $9 billion of spending next year.
Real spending growth is a fraction of what we inherited and a fraction of the 30-year average.
Still $9 billion net into the economy in the next year.
You need to look at the composition of that spending. That spending is a combination of our cost of living relief that we've just talked about at some length, combined with things that any reasonable person would consider to be unavoidable spending. Things like extending health programs, palliative care, cancer care. Services like MyGov wasn't funded in an ongoing way by our predecessors. And so that spending next year is made up entirely, that extra spending is made up entirely of unavoidable spending pressures and the cost of living package.
Let me just come back to the question I asked you before. Why is giving people money not putting demand into the economy? That is the conventional economic wisdom.
Well, I don't think that is consistent. The view that you're putting is consistent with the advice that we received from Treasury.
So how do they explain that more cash in people's pockets doesn't cause demand? If they gave you that advice, they must have explained it.
Well, first of all, people
don't
have a lot of spare cash lying around. You know, we're in a.
You're about to give them some.
People are under extreme cost of living pressure. That's the first point. Secondly, there is a behavioural difference to sending someone a cheque and encouraging them to spend it, or taking a bit of the edge off some of their bills. There is a world of difference between those things. The professional economists and forecasters in the Treasury have given us very clear advice. They don't expect there to be upward pressure on inflation in our economy more broadly. Remember as well, we're talking about a $2.6 trillion economy, and we're talking about a handful of billions of dollars in cost of living help. And so I think we need that perspective too.
Do you still recognise that it's a gamble?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we've taken a pretty cautious, pretty conservative, responsible and restrained approach to this budget. We have spoken many times about budgets, and I don't see budgets as anything other than an opportunity to get the budget in better nick, to help people where we can, but also to set out a vision for the future, which is another important part of the budget.
And we'll come to that in just a moment, but I just want to look more broadly at the other inflationary pressures that are around. So you've got the tax cuts, you've got $10 billion that were added from the state governments on top of your household payments. So just for the last time, how does all of this combined not fire up inflation?
Because what we're talking about here is taking the edge off people's bills. People are under extreme pressure. They don't have lots of spare money lying around. And what we've also shown more broadly is that inflation, when we came to office, inflation had a 6 in front of it. It's now got a 3 in front of it. We've been able to do that without smashing the economy, without slashing and burning in the budget, and that's the approach that we will continue.
Let's go on to the future made in Australia. There's a big political dimension to this, as well as being a very ambitious policy, and we're just beginning to get the details explained to us. I just want to go to how the Prime Minister described it recently. He said it's a means of restoring faith with blue-collar workers. So I guess my question is, how big an investment are you planning to make to win back those blue-collar workers?
Well, this is about making sure that people are front and centre, and communities in a future made in Australia. It's about recognising that if we are going to attract and incentivise all of this investment in making Australia an indispensable part of the net zero global economy, then we need to make sure that there are benefits for workers and communities in that. And that's been our approach. Right across the budget, putting people front and centre, whether it's cost of living help or setting out a vision for the future of our economy. And that's why there is a substantial but responsible investment in a future made in Australia, making ourselves a renewable energy superpower and capturing the full benefits for our people from the way that the global economy is changing and how that pace is accelerating, with an emphasis on net zero.
So frankly, there is a political and an electoral dividend to making this investment.
No, it's not political to say that you want people to be beneficiaries of change in our economy.
It is political to say that you're using this particular policy to win back blue-collar voters who deserted the party in 2019.
I don't see
which is what the Prime Minister said.
I don't see it in political terms.
Have you talked about it with the Prime Minister? Because those are the terms that he used.
He wouldn't see it in political terms either.
Well, that's how he put it.
No, well, I knock around with the Prime Minister a bit, and I know how he approaches this. And he approaches it...
I'm just using the language that he used about it.
He's approaching this the same way I am. In a world of churn and change, we need to get our workers and our communities a bigger slice of the action. That means teaching and training them to take full benefit of the way the global economy is changing. It means investing in communities, attracting private investment so that we can make the most of this opportunity.
So when he said it was also about bringing back blue-collar workers to the party, to the ALP, did he misspeak?
I don't see it that way, and I don't think that's the only interpretation of what he said. And we are the party of the workers. Blue-collar workers, of course, but also care economy workers, a big emphasis in the budget on the care economy as well. My reason for being, in every single budget, my reason for being is to make our people the primary beneficiaries of the way that the global economy is changing, not victims of that change. That's why I'm here talking to you on budget night once again, is because I deeply believe that Australia's got this unbelievable opportunity and that if we don't play the cards that we've been dealt, it will be an egregious breach of our generational responsibilities. And the way that we best serve and service those responsibilities is to put real people and real communities at the centre of our economic policy making.
Let me just talk to you very briefly about some other real people, and those are people on job seeker. You know that we've got unemployment forecast to rise. Food bank salvos, they all wrote to you before the budget asking for you to raise job seeker. You haven't. Do your budget priorities suggest that you care more about people who have jobs than those who don't? No, I don't think that's a fair interpretation. And also, we increased job seeker in the last budget by $40 a fortnight. I think job seeker's about $100 or $120 higher a fortnight since we've come to office. And I respect... Not enough for a proper living, according to all those people on the front line.
There is more than
including economists.
There is more than one way to help people who are especially vulnerable, including the jobless, energy rebates, rent assistance, and in other ways too.
Just moving on to the bigger question. So you're taking a bow today because you've produced this second surplus, but I want to ask you about the much bigger question, which is to do, well, the other very big question, which is to do with the shape of the budget to come, the structural deficit in the budget. Your own head of Treasury, who you were walking around Parliament House today, Stephen Kennedy, said that tax increases will be needed, along with spending cuts, to fix the long-term budget problem in Australia. When will you take his advice?
We've taken it in this budget. There are tax changes in this budget which help repair the budget position.
But not to the extent that they're going to start working away at that long-term structural budget problem.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
So where is it?
Well, there are changes in this budget around tax compliance, multinationals, the way foreigners are treated in the capital gains system. We've made way more tax changes and tax reforms than people usually acknowledge, and that is part of the reason why we're making such stunning progress cleaning up the mess that we inherited in the budget.
Is that the kind of tax change that the head of Treasury would regard as the sort of reform you need to address that structural budget problem?
Well, I work closely with the head of Treasury, as you'd expect. I've worked with a few of them over the years, and they know my approach is to take seriously the opportunities for tax reform, to work through it in a sequenced and methodical way, and that's what you see again in this budget.
Treasurer, again, congratulations on the budget, and thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. As you just heard, the Treasurer insists that the cost of living relief offered in tonight's budget will not add to the inflationary pressures in the economy and make the job of the Reserve Bank more difficult. But what do the budget papers tell us about that claim? Here's our political reporter, Tom Crowley.
The economic story is all about inflation at the moment. When will we be rid of it, and how much damage will it do us along the way? Well, tonight we heard the government's answer, and the short version is it'll be sorted by Christmas. By that time, the budget papers expect that we will have inflation back under 3%, households starting to spend again, slightly more job losses, but not too many, wages growing strongly, and interest rates ready to start falling again in the new year. If that sounds like an appealing package, it is. But as we heard last week, the RBA is not quite as optimistic. It thinks inflation will stay higher for longer. Enough that last week it weighed up not a rate cut, but another rate rise. Now, it's not that unusual for the RBA and Treasury to have slightly different views about the future. But here is where it does get unusual, because this budget is adding $9.5 billion in new spending to the economy in the next financial year. What is that spending? Well, it's a mixed bag. Some things like defence and aged care and new medicines may not make much difference to inflation. But energy bill relief, a $300 discount for everyone in the country, that's a lot more controversial, because it might lower your power bill today, but economists worry about fueling more inflation tomorrow once people spend that extra money. Treasury says nothing to worry about. It won't make a material difference to inflation. But if you don't believe that, it gets harder to believe Treasury's numbers. We can expect that debate to play out over the coming days. But of course, the real question is, what will the RBA believe? Will they see this $9.5 billion as no big deal, especially when you consider that states are spending another $9 billion in their own budgets? Or will their concern about inflation lead them to one more rate rise before the deadline for the next federal election? It's too early to tell, but in the end, that is going to be the real test of this budget.
For his reaction to the budget, I'm joined now by Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor. Angus Taylor, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, sir.
We just heard a discussion, some debate there from Tom Crowley about the way in which this may or may not influence an election. Are we looking at a pre-election budget?
Well, it's certainly a political budget. An extra $315 billion in spending since Labor came to power. That's over $30,000 for every Australian household. Sarah, and
I'm just going to push back on that figure because I think my colleague David Spears did the same thing at the weekend, which is that's not since Labor came to power. That's a figure that spreads over the forward estimate. So let's
but that is the
not
increase.
Confuse people.
But hang on, no, it's very important.
Funding.
The baseline was the last budget they were left from us, and since then, over the forwards, they've added $315
so they haven't spent it. Anyway, back to your point.
Except they plan to, and this is the point. And if you plan to spend a lot of money, it's inflationary. We've got a 16% increase in spending over 2 years, and the economy's only growing at closer to 7%. So that's spending growing at double the pace of the economy, and that takes you to a $43 billion structural deficit in 2 years' time. Now that's inflationary, Sarah.
All right,
and you know, it's when you've got $4 of spending for every dollar of savings, you're not fighting the inflation dragon, that homegrown inflation that so many Australians are suffering.
We've just had a long discussion about that. The results on that will come. But let me talk to you about the budget today and your immediate thoughts on it. So earlier on today, you were talking about the great pain beating down on households, pensioners, young people, those with mortgages. So do you support the government's billions of dollars in subsidies to those struggling Australians? Do you support that?
Well, what's clear in this budget is they're not going to the source of the problem. They're putting a band-aid on a bullet wound.
Let me just stay with that particular question. Do you support
this is it.
Cost of living relief
the context is incredibly important, and I will answer that question, but the context is hugely important. You should be dealing with the source of the problem when inflation is raging. The government isn't, because it's a political, big spending budget designed for an election, not for an inflationary cost of living crisis. Now, when all you've got is a band-aid to put on the bullet wound, that's what you do, and that's all that Labor is offering here. So we will support that, but not because we think that's ultimately the right answer. Labor has failed to deliver the energy price reductions they promised before they came to power.
But let's be not due until next year. But let's just talk about that. So you will support the government's cost of living relief going out to Australian households?
Sure, but this budget makes clear that they're not going to deliver that promise on electricity price reductions, and that's the result of that is this is the only band-aid to put on the bullet wound that Labor's left us.
If you'd been in government, what specific measures would you have brought in to squeeze inflation?
We would have, in the energy sector for starters, been driving more supply. But most of all, we would have been showing restraint, making sure that the fiscal rules are in place to fight inflation. What does that mean in practice? It means having a rule in your budget where you grow the economy faster than you're spending. Well, we've got spending in this budget over 2 years growing twice as fast
as the economy. Does that mean that the opposition would have been looking at an austerity budget?
No, it's just restraint. It's what every economist is saying right now. There needs to be restraint. It's not scorched earth. It's just sensible. Now, this is not a restrained budget. $4 of spending for every dollar of savings, Sarah. That's not restraint. We've got $13.7 billion in this budget. $1 billion of handouts to billionaires in production tax credits. I mean, that's not a restraint.
So you don't support money going to Twiggy Forrest or to Gina Reinhardt as part of Future Made in Australia?
We do not support those production tax credits. I mean, $13.7 billion is a massive spend. You know, if you want to get those resources sectors really firing. I worked in those sectors for many years before politics. You've got to drive down energy prices. You have to make sure you do the approvals in a timely way, not 14 years, which is the average.
But on the principle of Future Made in Australia, you don't object to the idea of in a sense, picking winners. You don't object to that.
Well, we absolutely
just don't like these winners.
We want to see a successful manufacturing sector, and particularly minerals processing, which is what a lot of the focus is on there.
So you'd be prepared to pick and back specific individuals and companies?
That's not what I said, if I can finish.
Sure.
We strongly support having those sectors being strong. We want them to be strong, and they have been strong in this country for a long while. But the way to get there is to focus on the fundamentals, not to throw money at them with subsidies. We don't support the $13.7 billion of production tax credits. There's much else in that MIA bill that we'll work our way through, there's many questions we have about the initiatives.
But to be clear, you would take away those tax credits.
The production tax credits, we cannot support billions in handouts to billionaires, no.
Angus Taylor, it was brief, but thank you very much indeed. We look forward to hearing more from you in the days ahead.
Good on you. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. And that's all we've got time for. Coming up, my very good colleague David Spears with a special edition of Insiders.
Power bill relief for all. No means testing strings attached to the government's latest cost of living sweetener. Every household will receive $300 off their bill. But even though spending is up, the Treasurer remains confident inflation will fall. I'm David Spears. Welcome to our Insiders Budget Night special. In a moment, I'll be joined by two leading economists for their take on this budget. And our panel of Insiders regulars is coming up. Laura Tingle, Phil Curry and Patricia Carvelis. First, a recap of the main points tonight. Treasury is more optimistic than the Reserve Bank about the outlook on prices. It forecasts inflation will fall to within the 2 to 3% target zone by the end of the year. The growth outlook for the economy has been dialed down a little, and the unemployment rate is expected to climb to 4.5% next year. A second surplus is on the cards of just over $9 billion. And it's almost certain to be delivered. There's only 6 weeks left in this financial year. It has been a long time since back-to-back surpluses were delivered. But then next year, the budget is set to head back into the red with a deficit of $28 billion forecast. And that's driven in part by a further increase in government spending. That bottom line figure, costs of policy decisions, including spending and savings decisions, the net effect is a further spending of $162 million for what's left of this financial year, but then $9.5 billion next financial year. And this graph shows you where most of that is going. Cost of living relief, a further $300 in energy bill relief, and this time it's going to every household, not just those on low incomes, as well as a million small businesses. That's worth $3.5 billion. Commonwealth rent assistance will also rise by a further 10% for nearly 1 million eligible households. And the maximum co-payment for prescription medicines is being frozen for a year and for 5 years for pensioners and concession card holders. All up, there's nearly $8 billion worth of new cost of living measures tonight. That's on top of the Stage 3 tax cuts, which flow from July. And finally, there's the Future Made in Australia plans. We have been waiting to see more details on this plan that the Prime Minister and the Treasurer have been promoting in recent weeks. $7 billion will be spent over a decade on a tax break for companies who process critical minerals like lithium and rare earths in Australia. And then a similar tax break will be offered for hydrogen production, green hydrogen production, along with another round of the Hydrogen Head Start program. And just over $3 billion has been set aside for so-called green metals and battery production. Now, some of this money won't flow for a few more years. There's still a bit of detail to be worked through here. But this is part of the government's plan to reshape the Australian economy to take advantage of the net zero transition. We've also just heard the opposition will not support those particular tax credits that have been announced tonight. Now, I've been lucky to spend this budget day in a budget lock-up alongside Chris Richardson from Rich Insights and Dr Aruna Sathanapalli, the CEO of the Grattan Institute. Very good evening to both of you. Chris, let me start with you. What's your broad take on this budget?
The budget paints a very, very beautiful picture. It's just not yet clear whether it's a believable picture. You laid out the beauty of it. You know, we don't just get tax cuts, we get lots of extra help, big dollars flowing fast from this government. And by the way, state governments have spent the last week and a bit telling us how much money they're going to throw at us as well. You have all that, and yet a very fast fall off in inflation. That's to some extent risking having our cake and eating it too.
Sounds like you don't buy it.
It's going to be hard to achieve, or more to the point, all right, the Reserve Bank has a really, really tricky juggle in front of it. This puts a lot of extra money into the economy. If that's spent, that makes inflation worse, even if the measured inflation is better.
So is this an expansionary budget?
Oh, for sure. It's thrown many billions, $9.5 billion in the next 12 months alone. The government said, it wouldn't front load stuff. It would be careful not to poke the inflationary bear. It would put it out the back. They've absolutely got it up the front.
So this, Aruna, brings us to the discussion around whether offering energy bill relief does push downward pressure on inflation. We heard the Treasurer arguing very strongly that that's the advice of Treasury. This puts downward pressure on inflation. Does it?
So in one simple sense it does. So by bringing down the price that people pay on their energy bills by $75 a quarter, that will bring down the measured price when the ABS measures CPI. So he's not wrong that we'll see that kind of mechanical reduction in inflation.
In the measured price.
In the measured price.
Right.
The trick is that money saved is money potentially spent. So if people spend that $75 a quarter, then, to Chris's point, that's money in the economy. So some of this will turn on what people actually do with the money, but what you see in the immediate measurement might not actually be.
Yeah, I heard. Jim Chalmers referred to behavioural difference. If you send someone a $300 cheque, they might spend it, I suppose is his argument. But if you take it off their power bill, maybe they save it.
It's a possibility.
Who knows?
People will behave differently. I think it's fair to say that households that are really under pressure, that need the $75, are more likely to spend it.
Right.
Ironically, it's probably the people who don't need it who are less likely to spend it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So is $300 in a rebate going to every household, not just those who really need it? Is this the best way to tackle cost of living?
So I'd say no. It isn't a well-targeted measure. Everyone's getting the benefit from it. Unfortunately, that's part of the reason why it's probably going to be quite effective in terms of inflation measurement, because it's broad-based. But ultimately, the sorts of things that are happening elsewhere in the budget are probably better targeted.
Well, what about? I was going to ask you about the rent assistance. So it went up 15% last year, goes up another 10% in tonight's budget, and it is targeted, isn't it? At it's about 1 million households.
That's right. Look, that's right. And Grattan has called for this. It called for this increase last time. There was a partial increase last time. The government's put a little bit extra in. This is a really effective way of getting help to people who are doing it really hard. And you can see it in the spending data at the moment. You can see how there are particular groups in society who are pulling back dramatically on how much they're spending. And what that tells us is that they are struggling to pay for essentials. So rent assistance is one of the ways that you can treat the symptoms, but it doesn't treat the fundamental sickness, which is the shortage of housing.
Well, let's talk about that because, Chris, we've known for a while the government has a target for 1.2 million new homes to be built by the end of this decade. Now, they've made big announcements in the lead up to tonight's budget, reflected in the documents tonight. What do you reckon? How confident are you about that target being reached?
Well, the government is clearly very confident that it won't be reached. Remember, there are economic forecasts in here, and they say that the pace of housing construction that's fallen in the last couple of years won't go anywhere next year. The year after, it'll finally start to pick up, but even then, it'll be lower than it was 5 years ago. No, we're going to miss that target by a country mile. The government gets it. It understands the problem. It's talking the talk. Some of its measures make sense, but it's mostly throwing dollars at a problem that needs, a stick rather than a carrot. It needs feds yelling at the states, yelling at local councils, build.
Let's zoom out. We get a second surplus this year, then we're back into deficit, and we're really in deficits for as far as the eye can see for the next decade. This, Aruna, points to the structural problem we hear about in the budget. Is enough being done to tackle the fact that we're spending more than we're earning?
No. And so this is something it's clear in the budget papers. If you look at the coming years, you can see that the deficits are in large part structural. And what that means is that they arise from this mismatch between how much tax we're willing to pay and the kind of services that we want. And sometimes when commodity prices are high, we don't have to make tough choices because we've got enough revenue to cover it. But once those sorts of cyclical factors die away, we're left with the fundamental issue. Now, One of the things I will say about this budget is that it owns up to some of these issues at least. Like, at least we've got more plausible spending forecasts than we may have had in some, previous years around how much doing the things we want done cost. For instance, paying aged care workers, paying childcare workers, but we're not raising enough to pay for it.
And there are some things that, Chris, I know you argue we shouldn't necessarily be spending money on, which brings us to those GST top-up payments, often described by economists, including you, as some of the worst policy measures we've ever seen. We find out tonight an updated cost of these GST top-up payments that go from the Commonwealth to the states.
The last time we got an official read on the dumbest policy in the budget, the biggest waste of taxpayer money, if people understood it, they'd have cried to read that the old estimate was $40 billion over 10 years. It's now $52.9 billion over 10 years. It's nothing to do with, building a better Australia, a future made in Australia. It's all about industrial size, marginal state strategy. Western Australia's key to the next election. It gets every dollar that it shouldn't.
Chris, Aruna, thank you both very much for your help through the day and your analysis tonight. Really appreciate it. Well, ultimately, the government will need to pass the measures in tonight's budget through the parliament, and that means either winning the support of the opposition or the crossbench. We're going to hear now from the key crossbench players in this building, beginning with the Greens leader. Adam Bandt, welcome to the program. Let's just start on the cost of living relief, the energy bill relief, the rent assistance. Are they measures that you will support?
Well, these are Band-Aid measures. Labor's Band-Aid budget is a betrayal of people who are doing it tough. It's a betrayal of renters, of mortgage holders, of women, of students. Meanwhile, the Labor's budget backs unlimited rent increases. Supermarket prices are going to continue to rise. Labor's tightening your belts while letting big corporations and billionaires run wild. There's a lot more that could have been done to tackle this crisis.
But will you back these cost of living measures?
Well, we would like to see electricity treated as an essential service and not as a profit-making entity. So I think there's a lot more that could be done to bring down the cost of electricity, get more renewables into the system, treat it as an essential service. But on rent assistance, Labor is boasting about this increase to rent assistance. About 75% of renters in this country don't get rent assistance. Of the ones who do, not all of them get full rent assistance. Of the full rent assistance that they're going to get from this, they'll get about $1.40 a day. At the same time as the Reserve Bank says that average rents are going to go up by $46 a week. Now, so Labor has the capacity to do much more. And meanwhile, can I say there's over $100 billion.
I just wanted to get some clarity for the viewers here. You will back the increases, though?
Well, we will fight for more because there's much more that could be given here. We need to have funding for a rent freeze because unlimited rent increases, where the Reserve Bank of Australia says they're driving inflation in this country, is going to push people to the brink. Unlimited rent increases, stopping without not tackling price gouging at the supermarkets. Again, Jim Chalmers talked a big game and delivered nothing in this budget.
On the tax breaks for green hydrogen production and the processing of critical minerals, the opposition, we've heard Angus Taylor tonight say they won't support those, brings the Greens into play. Are you willing to back those?
Well, we've always called for more support for clean industries, for growing the green mining, green metal sector. But what's clear from this budget, when you look at those measures compared with what Labor's giving to fossil fuels, is that Labor's future made in Australia is a future for coal and gas past 2050. $5 billion spent in this budget on climate measures, $50 billion being spent on fossil fuel subsidies. They tried to bury the gas strategy in the back of the budget.
OK, sorry, just to be clear for people, the measures they've announced tonight, these tax breaks, you will support those?
Well, we have always called for more assistance to be given to green metals, to green minerals. That is a critical part of our future. But you've got to look at this as a package.
Billionaires, you mentioned earlier, people like Gina Reinhardt or Andrew Forrest.
Well, we've always said in Queensland, for example, the best job for a coal miner is another mining job. And if we can find ways of creating sustainable jobs in mining industry of critical minerals, then we campaigned on that. We support that. But what is clear, though, is that Labor is greenwashing with this plan, because they have made crystal clear that they now want coal and gas running out past 2050. And there's $50 billion in this budget, much more than they're giving to any of those measures that you just talked about, that's going on fossil fuel subsidies. So our job when it comes to Parliament is to say to Labor, well, no, you can't keep funding coal and gas past 2050.
All right, Greens leader Adam Ban, thanks for joining us tonight. I want to go to the independent Senator Jackie Lambie, who's joining us now. We are doing a quick whip around here, so apologies, our time is tight. But Senator, what's your take on the cost of living measures? Firstly, we know this $300 rebate will go to all households, not just those under any sort of means test. Are you comfortable with everyone getting this rebate?
Absolutely, just like I'm not comfortable with people like myself and the super rich out there. They've got a $4,500 tax cut. So for all you poor people out there, I tell you what, and then we're obviously getting the $300, not means tested. What are we, back in COVID days where we're just chucking money left, right and centre? Seriously, you're too lazy to do some means testing. We don't need $300, I can assure you, and that should have been passed forward. I find it really, really bizarre that we're running around going about what's going on with our mental health out there, both through adults and kids, and we're spending $40 million extra this year. You can't be frigging well. You've got to be joking me. You've got to be joking me. You know, we have kids out there. We can see what's going on with the kids out there that are completely out of control. Not a mention about cleaning any of that up with what's going on with the kids out there, which to me is really, really worrying. I mean, for goodness me, David, they've got an election coming up in Launceston and there's youth crime off its head up there. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to know about it, let alone supply places for our kids to go with drug and alcohol problems and youth issues. They don't want to supply this. They don't want to talk about it. Let's talk about the TAFEs, David. Let's talk about the TAFEs. You're talking about, what is it, $88.8 million to deliver 20,000 new TAFE places. Well, I don't know, but you want to go down to my TAFEs in Tasmania because they're full of asbestos. They don't have the equipment that is needed to train on. I mean, this is a joke. This is an absolute joke. What this is, they've had 2 years. 2 years, mate. They've been in, 2 years now that they've been in? This is the best budget they can come up with. Oh, my God.
Let me ask you about the longer-term view here. We are looking at a return to deficits for quite some time, this structural problem in the budget. Does that concern you? Are you prepared to support tougher measures to tighten the belt?
I tell you what concerns me more than anything is when you see numbers in a book with no detail or where that spending's going. Well, they just plucked that out of their backside, did they, mate? How about you tell us exactly where that money's going? It's like the Indigenous. I said $800 million they're putting into the jobs program. I think it's the jobs program because it's got no detail on it. So seriously, you've had 2 years in there, no detail, really disappointing, and this is the best you guys can come up with.
All right, Senator Jackie Lambie, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks very much.
Finally, in this crossbench whip around, I'm joined by the independent Senator David Pocock, who's with us this evening. Thanks for your time. Let me also start on the cost of living measures that are there tonight. What do you make of them?
To not means test them is frankly ridiculous. I think maybe politicians are just out of touch. We've got 3 million Australians living in poverty in this country. And you're going to give me and other politicians on six-figure salaries $300? It doesn't make sense to me. I hope they've got a really good reason for it.
Let me ask you about the Future Made in Australia plans, because I know you've been, as many of us have, waiting to see some of the details here. This is about trying to set us up for the transition to net zero over the years and decades ahead. Do you support what they've put on the table tonight in this budget?
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly for hydrogen and critical minerals, this is great. Good investments in them. I think there's a real missed opportunity when it comes to manufacturing things like solar cells here in Australia. We're so reliant on China. We have all the materials to do that. We have companies wanting to do that, and yet we haven't seen tax credits for that. The other bit I think that is missing from the Future Made in Australia is household electrification. It is such a huge opportunity to be spurring investment and investing in companies that are working in that space, because if we can lead that here in Australia, we can export it to the world.
So you're talking about what, household subsidies to shift from gas to electric?
I think investing in smart meters and everything that we need to do that. But I think, yes, separately, when we look at $300 to every household in Australia, I think we would be much smarter as a country investing in household electrification, where households can be saving $2,000 to $5,000 every year going forward. We know it's anti-inflationary because you're locking in the price of electricity. You're not saving $300 and then paying more the next year. You're saving year on year. So I think they could have been a lot smarter, and really disappointing not to see household electrification factoring in any way, given just what it could do for household budgets in this country.
All right, Senator David Pocock, thank you for your hot take on the budget this evening. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, David. Cheers.
Well, let's bring in our panel now, and joining us, political editor of the Australian Financial Review, Phil Curry, chief political correspondent for 7:30, Laura Tingle, and the host of Q&A and RN Breakfast, Patricia Karvelas. Very good budget evening to all of you. I've seen a couple of takes on this, Phil, being a budget that lays the groundwork for an early election. What do you reckon?
I think it definitely gives them the option. And when earlier could either be the end of this year or earlier next year than May. I don't think they'd want to do another budget after this. We get this sort of surplus this year, then we go heavily into deficit for the next 4 years and stay there for the next 10 years. And there's a lot of spending, and if the inflation gamble doesn't work, things could start going the wrong way quickly. So I don't know if others agree with me, but my first thought was this is may not be an early election budget, but it's certainly one that gives them the option.
There's certainly more spending, and it is heavily weighted in the coming financial year. Laura, inflation, though, that Phil mentions, is really the big test, both economically and politically right now for this budget.
Absolutely. And while I was listening to the crossbenchers all spewing as with
their very mild remarks,
spewing as our senator from Tasmania might have said. What is this about? Giving everybody $300 has two, rationales. Politically, Labor caucus members have been saying for the last 12 months we've got nothing to actually sell out there. They've got to have some sort of measure on top of the tax cuts to say, look, we are helping you. That's just pragmatic politics.
And they did take some of the tax cuts off the top end.
That's right. But I think more significantly, this is about a mechanical reduction in the CPI and in measures of inflation, which will maximise the chances that the Reserve Bank at the end of this year will be able to say, well, the rates are sort of back within target range. Now, this is a big punt.
But this is the clever trick, of some have called it, of finding a way to give people money that also drives down inflation. If it really does that, why not go even further, right? Why not give people $500, $600?
Because they are trying to be restrained. I mean, it might be an early election budget in the sense that I think it all hinges on that interest rate punt, if you like. But it's not, I mean, there's people, speaking of spewing, there's people all over this building really furious about this budget because it hasn't provided a lot of support for people at the bottom. Yeah. There isn't a lot of spending. They haven't gone out there and said, oh, OK, here's a list of people we've got to appease. They've tried to, I think, do some of the structural stuff in the budget. I'm still not sure what the whole Future Made in Australia thing is.
We're going to come to that because we've got you guys for a little bit, and there's a lot to explore in that. But look, PK, they haven't gone with another big job seeker increase. That will disappoint some. But there is still an increase in spending in net terms of about $24 billion over the coming 4 years. When inflation's a problem, when the structural deficit is a problem, that's significant.
It's definitely a risk that they've taken, but ultimately, and in the planning of this budget, consistently every senior person said to me, there's only one thing on our minds for this budget and everything we do, which is that we want an interest rate cut by Christmas. That up front. We want interest rates to start coming down. It is overwhelmingly the biggest issue in so many households. Now, they have managed to deliver cost of living relief in a way, whether it's too clever, let's see, we have to wait. But I think $3 billion in cheaper medicines, pausing the increase in the price of medicines. These things are a big deal to people. People really rely on medicines to get through the week. These are not small things.
It tells you it's probably smart politics because Angus Taylor very quickly tonight backed in the cost of living.
Yeah, he was like, right, yeah, absolutely. Rent assistance goes up for the second year in a row, and that's not happened in, well, certainly not a very long time, certainly not for a very long time. So obviously that puts downward pressure on inflation too in rents.
The spending though, Phil, when we look at what the government, what the Treasurer has been saying since he came in, we've got these 5 spending pressures that are there.
Well,
and are they doing enough to address?
Well, they'd better get a mention tonight. I mean, in terms of all the new spending, I mean, it's $32 billion in gross spending since my FA, offset by $8 billion in revenue. So as you said, it's a $24.5 billion extra, and that's put down to unavoidable spending pressures, which are things like health programs and the MyGov website and stuff that needs to be recurrently funded that wasn't. And then there's the power price stuff. It's $3.5 billion in 1 year, rent, et cetera, and then you get to the 5 big pressures. Defence is up by $5 billion over the next 5 years, and the NDIS.
The NDIS.
The biggest.
Hold that thought.
Sorry.
Now, I've got to just mention for our viewers on the ABC main channel, you're about to leave us for the latest episode of Creative Types with Virginia Trioli. Everyone else, stick around.
Aren't we creative enough?
And no, we're going to stick with this very creative panel, the News Channel, and continue this conversation. Because, sorry, just...
so the NDIS, everyone knows it's out of control and the government's trying to get the growth rate back to 8% by 2026. It grew at 21% this year.
Hang on, Phil.
And then it's dropping to 9%. But the biggest saving in the budget is a $14 billion haircut to the NDIS over the next 4 years. There's not a lot of saving in here.
Well, I think the interesting thing is they've cut $14 billion from the NDIS in one pocket, and then they've put sort of basically $15 billion in another way. I mean,
it was a remarkable coincidence, Deirdre Chambers, wasn't it, that the increase in the NDIS matched the saving?
Whether it matched or not, the point about it is they are actually doing work. Now, can I understand what the gobbledygook in the budget is about what they're actually doing here? They are trying to change the way people use the NDIS and make it more efficient. But to shift $14 billion worth of spending in one way, rearrange it in $15 billion, something is going on there. Now, I mean, whether it's the NDIS, aged care, childcare, all these sectors of the care economy, we all know they're just busting at the seams. There isn't enough staff. They've got to put money in there.
This is what they call the unavoidable spending pressures. They made it pains to use that word, unavoidable.
Like we must.
So, I mean, I would sort of argue that the NDIS, shift in funds suggests that there is work underway. We don't know what the quality is. I mean, without a doubt, they recognise that it's blowing out. They're trying to do something about it. They probably haven't done enough yet.
They are, but I do think, though, I mean, you saw Jackie Lambie, we, obviously laughed about it because she has such a manner and such a turn of phrase, right?
Yeah, but doesn't leave you wondering.
The point she makes, watch this space over the next couple of days. I think Laura's right. There is a broad view that, hang on a minute, like everyone's feeling the cost of living pressures, even higher income people are feeling cost of living pressures. They are that intense after 13 interest rate rises. But this question around why do you deserve $300? And politicians like Jackie Lambie and like David Pocock saying, I don't need this, is going to be a political problem for the government, I think, at a time like this.
They are difficult to means test power bills, discounts, because the power companies, when they did...
But hang a minute, it was targeted the last time they did.
Yeah, but a lot of states gave it to everyone. There was a half state, half federal, and in the end it got too hard and most states just handed them to everyone. But
I never got one.
But going back to Laura's point, I mean, and David Pocock was saying, why it's not means tested, because the real MO of this is to deliver a $3.5 billion hammer blow on inflation.
To the rate.
To the rate to get the RBA to drop it by half a point. And that's, if they means tested it, if they just... we were some of us were led to believe before that it was only going to go to people on welfare because everyone else got a stage 3 tax cut, but that wouldn't have had the requisite impact on inflation.
I want to get your thoughts on the future made in Australia, which we've been waiting to see some detail on. We've seen some tonight. We're going to hear more, though, from our finance reporter, David Chow, about how these production tax credits that have been announced are actually going to work.
Well, after a wasted decade of climate inaction, the government now wants Australia to be a renewable superpower. As part of the Future Made in Australia policy, it plans to spend $22.7 billion over the next decade to whip up interest from companies in the private sector for investments in renewables and industries which it considers critical to Australia's economic security. Basically, the government is hoping to spark a manufacturing boom, just like the United States experienced after the Biden administration pledged trillions of dollars in support for companies investing in certain industries that further its national security. Other places like the European Union are also adopting similar measures to attract more investment. So the Australian government felt a bit of FOMO and followed suit. As for who receives this generous financial support in Australia, the government will make these decisions based on whether it's in our national interest. One way to get the cash is through the Net Zero Transformation Stream. Basically, the government is looking at whether a project can make a significant contribution towards net zero emissions. And it's already earmarked renewable hydrogen, green metals and low-carbon liquid fuels as the industries to back. The other way is through its Economic Security and Resilience Stream, which covers sectors which are vulnerable to supply disruptions. The government says that includes the refining of critical minerals like lithium, cobalt and rare earths, and the manufacturing of clean energy tech like solar panels and electric batteries. Interestingly, even though the Future Made in Australia policy and its national interest framework haven't been passed into law yet, the government has already picked some winners without going through that formal process. It's already spending $1 billion to try and encourage more businesses to manufacture solar panels here, even though China makes them a lot cheaper. $523 million to create a local manufacturing industry for electric batteries, $470 million to build a quantum computer in Brisbane, and up to $200 million for Arafura Rare Earths, a company backed by billionaire Gina Rinehart, to develop its refinery in the Northern Territory. And there's a little bit of support for small businesses as well. The government will extend the instant asset write-off, so small businesses with annual turnover of less than $10 million will be able to immediately deduct eligible assets costing less than $20,000 until the middle of next year. And to help ease inflation pressures, 1 million small businesses will receive $325 worth of energy bill relief. Every little bit counts, I suppose.
All right, so tonight, back to the panel here. Tonight's announcements on Future Made in Australia tell us they're going to be tax breaks or production tax credits for processing critical minerals here, so you already dig them out of the ground, but to process them in Australia, but then also to produce green hydrogen as well. $22.7 billion, but that's over 10 years. When you compare that to what some other countries are doing in this space, Laura, it's not that big, is it?
Well, it's not. And of course, it's basically going to be driven by the extent to which companies decide, oh, well, OK, this works for us. Now, I think the government's decision last week on gas changes a lot of the cost bases of those decisions, which is unfortunate. And I think also one of the things I still have a bit of trouble with is they kept on talking about how there was going to be this major initiatives framework and everything. It's a little bit unclear to me, David, how all of this is going to be run.
Apparently you're talking about a front door tonight?
Yeah, the front door. I'm not quite sure where the front door is, but, you know, we'd all like to see it. But Treasury seems to be in charge of all of this.
Yes.
But you've got all of these different bodies like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, various other parts of the bureaucracy all being brought into it.
Yeah, they're going to write up an act of Parliament. It's going to have this investment front door. But a lot of this, Phil, sounds like it's still being...
It's a series of parallel tracks under a single umbrella. That was explained to me.
All I know is that Andrew Twiggy Forrest is having a good...
Is he the biggest winner of this?
Well, he's been running around here for years with his hat out, wanting money to...
He was pretty happy last year when they kick-started it.
Right into hydrogen. This is his big bet.
And Western Australia just thinks it's absolutely splendid.
Well, this is what I was going to ask. How much
Another happy
is
day
also
for them.
done with an eye to where Labor needs to hold seats and win seats?
Well, the entire election's about the resource states, Queensland, and was the gas decision, the EPBC deferral, so it's part of that. So,
but hang on, is there a risk too that if we don't do this, then we're going to be left behind?
I think the argument that Jim Chalmers makes, right, when he's pressed on this, is this value for money, is this a waste of taxpayers, like all very reasonable questions. is that point that this is the direction of the world. We mentioned what's happening in the United States. It's happening everywhere. That to not do it is an incredibly risky thing.
The hydrogen credits, as I understand, are a little bit bigger in the United States than here, but we have the capacity to do green hydrogen because of our space.
And to not create the environment where we exploit our own resources, like, you know, we kind of need to at least give it a red hot go, right?
Exactly. We've got to
Were you surprised at all that Angus Taylor tonight said they're not going to support these tax?
Not at all. I'm not surprised, because I think this goes back and it puts pressure on Peter Dutton on the nuclear question. So they've put that on the table. They're not telling us when. I think it was meant to happen around now, and they've clearly delayed, as I think you found out, David, and have talked about. And so, you know, in fact, Sarah Ferguson, in her excellent interview with Angus Taylor, pressed him on where, you know, is he against picking winners? He kind of fudged a little on that, because perhaps that's exactly what they're going to do with nuclear.
Is if you can get energy prices down and you know, fix up industrial relations, that's going to be enough to attract all these investments, will it?
Well, that's what the big miners are saying. Like, this critical minerals credit is not just about future made in Australia. Remember, BHP's Nickel West is struggling to stay competitive with what's going on right now in Indonesia, with the Chinese backing this dirty, filthy nickel extraction. But BHP has sort of said already, look, a tax credit won't cut it. It's not going to save us. They just want more favourable operating conditions, you know, unwind some of that IR stuff, etc., which the government's not going to do. And I'm pretty sure this tax credit for critical minerals actually doesn't start to 27, according to the budget papers. So, look, it's... I agree. You know, as Albanese and Chalmers have said, it's not just a handout scheme, this Future Made in Australia. It is using the tax system, because we just can't compete financially with the US or anyone. So you use what you can, and this is, I think, a perfectly reasonable.
And the question is, what's the alternative?
Just to wrap this up, budgets these days, look, a week from now we probably won't be talking about it, but will this help the government politically, Laura, what they've done tonight?
I think it gives them all you can. I mean, let's forget budget bounces. It gives them a solid bit of stuff to talk about. Let's just not forget in all of this, the economy is basically barely breathing. You know, it's really on its knees. A lot of people are really, really hurting. So it gives them some story to tell over the next few months, in the hope that we do start to see inflation.
And you heard that line that I'm sure we'll hear from the Treasurer all week. We're giving every taxpayer a tax cut and every household some energy.
Absolutely. And as he said, we're not spraying around cheques, was one of his lines today that you'll hear a bit of, and the other one being, but we're not going to smash the economy. So to all the people who think it should have been more contractionary, this budget, that is his message. We are going to try and drive down inflation, is his point, without smashing the economy, and I think there is merit to that.
All right, PK, Laura, Phil, thank you very much for joining us after a very long day. Appreciate all of that. Well, millions of Australians with student loans will have hundreds of dollars wiped from their HECS debts. The government announced this last week. Annual HECS, there go the bells, we are in Parliament House. Annual HECS indexation will now be calculated on whichever figure's lower out of CPI and the wage price index. But some students are saying that doesn't go far enough. Shalila Medora has more.
For the past 7 years, Christian Harbour has been running his own landscaping company in Melbourne. But despite having a successful business with full-time staff and a dedicated client list, Christian and his partner aren't able to buy their own home.
We found that between the two of us, both of our HECS debts severely impact our ability to borrow money to live around a reasonable area.
Christian's had a few cracks at uni. When he was 18, he became the first member of his family to pursue tertiary education.
It was always something that I wanted to do to make both myself and my family proud.
He initially studied surveying, but found it wasn't for him. In 2020, he decided to study environmental engineering to better himself and his business. But the prospect of placements and the debt involved made him reconsider.
If I had to take anywhere upwards of 12 weeks to 24 weeks off to do placement, I would completely lose my business and be back to ground zero. If I'm still with these guys at 4, you're right to head home.
Christian's HECS debt isn't huge. He managed to pay a bit off and is now sitting around $18,000. But combined with his partner's debt of $50,000, he says it's limited the amount he can borrow to buy their first home near family and friends.
At the current rate, we're going to have a two-tiered society where the only way you can get ahead is if you're already wealthy.
There are around 2.9 million people with an outstanding HECS or HELP student loan in Australia. The cost of some degrees, like law, arts and engineering, has soared since HECS was introduced in the 1980s. Christian says the government's recent changes to the HECS system to tie the interest accrued on debts to the wage price index or CPI, whichever is lowest, fails to tackle the deeper issues in higher ed.
It really does nothing for me today while I don't have food on the table and I'm working 6 days and studying 6 days as well.
Christian, who's now 32, has decided to use his course credits from 2020 to finish off an environmental science degree. But he's working long hours in order to pay for the degree upfront to avoid piling up more debt.
I haven't taken Monday to Friday off since I registered the business in 2016.
Well, that HECS change we heard about in the lead up to the budget. Tonight, when it comes to higher education, there's a few more measures, but there's a big reform piece still to come when it comes to tackling course fees. The government is going to continue working on that before we hear an announcement. They have tonight agreed to a recommendation from the university's Accord report that it received some months earlier about setting a new target. 80% of Australians of working age, it wants to be either in some sort of vocational education or university course, having completed it by 2050. Now, it's a big step up in terms of the number of people completing some form of higher education. And we're going to talk about that a little further right now with Shalila Medora, who we just heard from there from Triple J's Hack program, Cassandra Goldie from the Australian Council of Social Service, and the Executive Director of the National Women's Safety Alliance, Catherine Burney. Thank you all for joining us. We're not just talking higher education, I should point out here. We'll get to a few other things as well. But Shalila, we just saw your piece there on the HECS change. As I mentioned, there's a few other things in tonight's budget. This new target to have 80% of working age Australians with some form of higher education, what are they doing to achieve that?
Good question. We don't quite know. Basically, it's all still in the works because it's part of this big university accord, which still needs to be ironed through. But what we do know from this budget is an acknowledgement that in order to get to this 80% mark, we need to drastically increase the number of people from disadvantaged groups who go to university. So there are a few measures in this that try and make that equity issue a little bit easier. Things like preparatory courses for university, so that once you're in university, you can succeed with your courses. An acknowledgement that the funding model is going to have to change so that places are uncapped essentially for people with disadvantage. But how that's going to be funded and what model that's going to take and when we're going to see that, that's all still yet to be worked out.
Let's turn to what's there in the budget tonight, Cass, when it comes to welfare recipients. Last year we saw the job seeker increase. I know you were hoping to see a further increase tonight. What do you make of where they've landed?
I think it's a gaping hole at the heart of the budget, David. I mean, here we are, we've got a budget that's going to deliver $26 billion in tax cuts from 1 July, including $4,500 to people on the very highest incomes in the country. And we've now got an energy rebate of $300 that's going to go to everybody, every household.
You're not happy about that?
Including people on the highest incomes in the country. And yet, in the face of leading economists saying, fix the adequacy of job seeker and youth allowance. Over 300 prominent women from all over the country saying to secure women's safety, fix the adequacy of social security. You have an aspiration of wanting young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to go into education. They've got to live on something, David. Youth allowance. This is the issue, and it should have been done, and it wasn't done. And we're very critical that this has been a failure of this budget to not deliver this in the face of a government saying the cost of living crisis was its first priority.
There is a change on job seeker we should just explain to people. Those who are working up to 14 hours a week will still be able to get the maximum rate, is that correct?
No. So this will help 4,700 people out of 1.1 million people on this payment.
Right.
It may help those people who've been assessed that their partial capacity to work is so significant that they're not able to work from between 0 hours or at a maximum 14 hours a week. Dave, those people probably should be on the disability support pension. And the disability support pension, as you know, has got harder and harder to get access. It's always been a savings measure. The disability support pension is $172 a week more than job seeker. So that is not the solution that we were all calling for, to be at the heart of this budget, to put people with the least first.
Catherine, the government did announce before budget night, some of its measures in response to concerns around women's safety. It announced the extension of the grants, the $5,000 grants for people fleeing intimate partner violence. They're now permanent. It announced more money for emergency housing as well. Is it enough?
Look, the escaping violence payment needed to be made permanent. I think the evaluation absolutely showed that whilst that is a necessary program, it was lacking in design. Now, that is a hangover from the previous government. It was a reactive measure and it wasn't fit for purpose. So I'm really pleased to see those new measures going in. Of course, we welcome housing. I don't think there's any refuge in Australia that says we are well funded. We have enough housing for women leaving violence. So that is absolutely essential. I'm not going to lie, though, I'm a little bit disappointed that there was no further investment in the National Partnership Fund. We are in a national crisis. There is no argument from any side of government there, but we seem to be bottlenecking the money that's coming into that fund, and we don't know where it is.
Just explain what that fund does.
So the National Partnership Fund is a fund of that comes from the federal government to the states and territories to our frontline services. What we're missing is an actual really comprehensive piece as to what's happening to that money once it leaves the federal treasury. And I would say that that is an urgent piece of work that we need to know, because, you know, we look from our perspective, our members are saying it's not coming to the front line, we can't meet capacity. And that's as simple as it is. It means that we are having women who are self-identifying, they're trying to leave violence, and they're told we've got a 6 to 12 month waiting list. We have 12-year-olds on sexual violence waiting lists in some jurisdictions.
12-year-olds?
12-year-olds. And in some jurisdictions, sexual violence services have not had an increase to core funding in 26 years, and it's a 6 to 12 month waiting list. So if you can imagine, you've gone, I've been sexually assaulted, you reach out for help, that is a hard thing to do, and you're told, you're going to need to get in line.
Sure.
I just wanted to jump in on this, because we know that 40% of homelessness people are aged under the age of 25, and the vast majority of them are leaving family violence situations. And while the Leaving Violence program is obviously very welcome, it doesn't address young people who may be experiencing violence from their parents or from a sibling. It's only intimate partner violence, and that was something I was really looking for in the budget, which we just didn't see.
And look, just very briefly, budgets are about priorities. You know, clearly you think some of the priorities tonight are just wrong. And Cass, you mentioned earlier you think things like the $300 rebate perhaps shouldn't have gone to everybody.
It shouldn't have.
But are there other areas you think money can be found to fund some of these things?
Yeah, I mean, where is the tax reform? Where are the changes to the housing tax breaks that have been fueling the extraordinary increases in housing prices, to the great benefit of people who've already got a property portfolio? No action there. We certainly haven't had anything tackling the rebates on fossil fuel industries. We've got tens of billions in investment in the Made in Australia, future Made in Australia. Yes, we need to transform these energy systems, but we didn't get the multi-billion-dollar investment in the retrofitting of housing, including for younger people, so they're not living in hot boxes because they can't afford access to the technologies.
We have to move on. I apologise, but look, I really appreciate you joining us tonight with your thoughts on this budget. Thank you. Our final guest tonight is someone who watches the Australian economy and the budget very closely, but from the other side of the world. I'm pleased to say, though, that he's made it to Canberra for the budget lock-up today. Stephen Hamilton is an Associate Professor of Economics at George Washington University, based in DC. Stephen, good to see you here in Canberra, though. Give me your take on this budget, having pored over the documents today.
Yeah, well, I have to be honest. When I opened the budget papers this afternoon and saw the reconciliation table that tells you all of the new measures the government is taking, I had this sort of Looney Tunes eyes popping out of my head at the $10 billion of new spending decisions. The deficit increasing by $10 billion in the coming year, which is a decision by government, right? So that comes on top of the $10 billion of new decisions in the last two budgets to increase the deficit. So
when they say unavoidable, you don't buy it?
Well, there's unavoidable spending, but if you have unavoidable spending, then you need to make room for it. Right, so the government has delivered a budget. The goal of a budget is to take a given envelope and to allocate it to the things that you prioritise. And I just don't see that in this budget. So we take, we have a $28 billion deficit in the coming financial year, and 20 of that 28 comes from new decisions in the last two budgets. So, make of that what you will.
So bottom line, is this budget going to drive up interest rates?
Yeah, so I think, again, if you think of that $20 billion, the rule of thumb that a lot of people use, Chris Ridgerton was on your program earlier, these people use is that every roughly $7 billion of additional deficit generates a quarter point increase in interest rates. So if we see $20 billion of new spending over the last two budgets, that's 2 or 3 interest rate increases. If we add that to the $24 billion of stimulus coming through the stage 3 tax cuts, that's $44 billion of stimulus to the economy. That's 1.5% interest rate increases. So, look, in a time like this, when the Reserve Bank is right on the edge, right, where they're right on the edge of raising rates, to be pushing this much stimulus into the economy, I think is a real risk.
All right, Stephen Hamilton, appreciate your take on the budget tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Cheers, Dad.
Well, it wouldn't be an Insiders episode without talking pictures, and here's Mike Bowers with a special behind-the-scenes take on Budget Day in Canberra.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer-at-large for The Guardian Australia. Welcome to a very special edition of Talking Pictures inside the lockup. Now, no matter what side of politics operates on the government benches, there's a recognisable rhythm, a cadence to Budget Day, and the lockup is one of those special occasions. This is where journalists, photographers and especially our very talented cartoonists get to see the budget papers and create work so that when the Treasurer hits the dispatch box at 7:30, all the work is ready to go. Let's go and see one of Australia's best, David Rowe. Hello, David.
Hey, Mike.
Welcome to Budget 2024. You're carrying a bit of an injury there, mate.
Yeah, I know, broken fingers,
I hope
but not on the drawing hand.
Look, it's very early in the day. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, I've been having a chat with Phil and Mike, and you've kind of got to come up with catch-all drawings, so you've got somewhere to go. So I'm working on a gallery at the moment, which is sort of Back to the Future Fund.
And will there be like a Valhalla moment where you pick up something that Phil Curry says and you go, oh, bing, that's it?
You hope so. Yeah. Like, that's how cartooning works. Yeah. Like, often you're doing the drawing and then all of a sudden it goes, right, that's the point that you want to make. So I sort of work back to front, so I sort of start my drawings and then the idea sort of hits.
Generate. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so I've got a theme, but then everything else sort of lands later.
And Curry has to lift his game. Lift your game, Curry. Oh, go get stuffed. So we're in the main committee room inside the lockup where the press conference with the Finance Minister Katie Gallagher and the Treasurer Jim Chalmers is about to take place, and I'm here with AAP photographer Lucas Koch. Lucas, we've just followed the Treasurer and Finance Minister around the press gallery in the lockup where they were trying to sell their budget. What were you trying to get? What was the picture you were trying to get?
I was trying to find a picture that goes past the pick up, and something human, a human element. And I have to say I failed so far. I couldn't get a good picture, and so I'm quite hopeful to find something here.
Pull something out of this. This is just two people at a podium, though. It's a pretty dry old photo opportunity. What are you looking for here? Are you looking for interaction between them, or what are you trying to do?
Yeah, it's definitely the interaction, but like you say, you have two podiums. You've got one backdrop, which is blue, and two people in a suit and a dress.
Yeah. It really is the cartoonist day, isn't it?
It is. I mean, unless he comes in with a card wheel.
Do you have to sort of give it a go? Yeah. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything?
I always tell my daughter that my job is turning up, and giving it a go, and sometimes you're lucky.
Well, David, we're deep into the lock-up now. It's nearly time to lift the embargo. Where have you landed with Budget 2024?
Well, I started off with a Back to the Future Made in Australia
Yeah, you had the
cartoon.
DeLorean
Michael J.
EV.
Fox.
Yep.
I just can't get the young Jim Chalmers out of my mind. But I think that'll probably end up being the editorial.
Inside.
And yeah.
So what have you got for the cover?
Well, I'm stuck on movie themes today. So I've gone for Timothy Chalamet.
Beautiful.
Taming the giant worm, which is a dragon, and sort of splashing a lot of cash. So I've had a chat with Phil and Mike, and hopefully this will be the cover. Like, it's still early days. We've got another hour and a half.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of 4 drawings in, and hoping one of these 2 works.
That's great, mate. Well, let's hope you don't have to start another one at this point in the proceedings.
I don't think I will. I'll have a fit.
With that, it's back to you, David.
Well, thank you very much, Mike Bowers, David Run and Lucas Koch there, and I suspect the Treasurer won't mind being drawn as Michael J. Fox from Back to the Future. He'll be happy with that one. We'll see what the rest of the cartoons look like in the papers tomorrow morning. Now, obviously, when it comes to budget papers, there are so many things that we could be talking about. We've kind of zeroed in on a few main items tonight. The cost of living package worth, $7.8 billion. Looks like that will go through with the support of the coalition we've heard tonight. And the Future Made in Australia elements, those longer-term investments, well, the Greens, they'd like more, but they look like supporting those as well. So the government looks like it will get, on the first blush, most of this through. Thanks for your company this evening. Stay with the ABC for the Business Budget Special with Kirsten Aiken. Good night.
Welcome to the Business Budget Special. I'm Kirsten Aiken. The Albanese government has delivered the first back-to-back surpluses in almost 2 decades, thanks to more people in work and higher commodity prices. The government is playing a bigger role in the economy and offering tax incentives for businesses with a $22.7 billion package to build a future made in Australia. Make no mistake, this is a pre-election budget, giving billions of dollars in cost of living relief to households in the form of energy subsidies, rent assistance and cheaper medicines. Those subsidies are expected to knock 0.5 percentage point off inflation next financial year. But they will come at a cost. Combined with spending on the NDIS, defence, interest debt payments, health and aged care, larger deficits are forecast for the years ahead, pushing gross debt out to more than $1 trillion. The economy is already weak and expected to grow at a sluggish pace. We'll speak to the Finance Minister shortly, as well as our panel of experts. But first, this report from Nadia Daly on the government's plan to turn Australia into a renewable superpower.
Cell by cell, this solar manufacturer has high ambitions to power up the nation.
The next step is to electrically connect all the solar cells together, and that's what this machine does.
The company's receiving funding under the $22.7 billion Future Made in Australia scheme, which promises to revive homegrown manufacturing and turn the country into a renewable superpower.
There is a global race in terms of setting up onshoring of solar manufacturing all around the world. And with the right policy settings, I do feel very strongly that Australia can be highly competitive. How the strings looking, Ken?
They're looking pretty good.
What will that mean for your business?
It's massive. So what that means is it allows us to get to scale, which reduces our costs and allows us to be globally competitive.
But it's going to be a tough market to crack. The industry is dominated by China.
It is true that 80 to 90% of the world's solar panels are produced in one country. However, solar manufacturing costs are changing. They're going to have to compete with nations that now have access to cheaper, cleaner electricity.
In the budget, there's more than $27 million for reforms to support rooftop solar, batteries and EVs. $3.2 billion for technologies deemed critical to energy transition. A tax incentive of $2 per kilogram for green hydrogen produced up to 10 years, and $7 billion for a critical minerals production tax incentive, worth 10% of processing and refining costs.
that'll allow Australia not just to do the mining, but to move one step further at value add.
Renascor Resources is another winner from the Future Made in Australia plan. It's getting funds to fast-track its graphite mine in South Australia.
We would expect the bulk of the material that we're going to be mining and then refining here in Australia to wind up in lithium-ion batteries and then go into electric vehicles.
To qualify for government funding, businesses must fit within the National Investment Framework, which focuses on green industries that help reduce emissions or contribute to economic security. Speaking before the budget was handed down, former ACCC Chair Rod Sims offered a warning on how the support should work.
If you are going to subsidise manufacturing in Australia, then make sure it is a subsidy and that it doesn't affect the pricing of particularly important supply chain goods for the green economy. I mean, we don't want unnecessarily high cost renewable energy.
And he says we need to be selective.
Early government support for industries where Australia has a comparative advantage. That's things like green iron, green urea, green polysilicon, things that are really energy intensive.
Intensive work to get to net zero.
Nadia Daly there. Earlier, I spoke to the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher. Minister, welcome. You're banking 96% of revenue upgrades this year to take pressure off inflation. What about next year?
Well, thanks for having me on. The revenue upgrades are certainly, they don't continue across the forward estimates. So it becomes a harder job, I think, as we don't see some of those increases that we've had in recent years to continue to put large amounts back into the budget. And we have, increasing pressures on spending. So I think since coming to government, we've saved about 82% of revenue upgrades. They've been put back in to make sure we can pay down debt and reduce deficits. But that job gets harder as the revenue increases decline, and we've got some of those real big areas of spending, those pressures are intensifying.
Next year, you're spending more than twice the upgrades. The inflation problem won't have disappeared by then, will it?
Well, in the 24-25 financial year, the spending really there, and we've had to show a lot of restraint. And so when you look at the combination of what is that spending happening in that year, it's really 2/3 of it's what we would see as unavoidable spending. So it's things like ICT rebuilds for aged care. It's programs that were just going to end that had no ongoing funding, but really aren't programs that should end. So a lot in the health space, the COVID-19 response. And that's about 2/3 of the net spend. The other third is really the cost of living relief package that we've announced in the budget today, which is, the extra help on energy bills, the rent assistance and cheaper medicine. So it's things like that which impact in that financial year. But we have also tried to find savings where we can, reprioritisations as well, to make sure that we're not putting too much pressure on the budget.
You've said cost of living relief will lower inflation. Many economists say it's true on the headline number, but could make things worse by giving people more money to spend. How confident are you it won't backfire?
Well, the advice to government is pretty clear, and we looked at how we rolled out the energy bill relief in the last budget. We were pretty happy with how that went and the downward pressure that it had on inflation. I think the announcement that we've made in this budget has a broader application of that, but that's recognition as well that, whilst, obviously our focus is on inflation, that households across Australia are really feeling the pinch, as are businesses, and this is a neat way that we can provide some extra support, which puts downward pressure on inflation at the same time and is time limited to that payment.
Could the cost of living assistance have been better targeted?
Well, a lot of the cost of living measures are targeted.
The $300 energy subsidy goes to every household. Not everyone is doing it tough.
Well, I think there has to be a recognition, and also in the design of the program, the way that we roll this out is through states and territories and the retailers. So it's through household bills. So there comes an issue around the design of the program as well and how to get this relief out. But The Commonwealth rent assistance increase is targeted, but the energy bill relief also recognises that, there are people doing it really tough who sit outside the concessions or the pension arrangements, and that this is a way that it's not money in your pocket, it's not in your bank account, this is going to be paid through your energy bill to put downward pressure on inflation and give some support at the same time. And we're seeing that pressure up and down the income scale.
Hopes for productivity growth underpin the future made in Australia. It is a big ticket item which will take years to pay dividends. A lot of experts, including your own Productivity Commissioner, question whether it is the best use of public money. Why will this bet pay off?
When you look at the whole the package as a whole, it's in the order of just over $22 billion over the medium term. That the vast majority of that support comes through the tax system, through the production tax credits. So, it's incentivising investment and production of the transition to net zero, and that's a real way where basically we're incentivising and paying on the production of, say, green hydrogen or through the refining and processing of critical minerals. So I think a lot of people before thought it would be through grants or other arrangements with specific industries or companies. But the way we've designed it is really to incentivise the production and the transition to net zero, and we think it will be successful, and it's also what a lot of people have been calling for.
Katie Gallagher, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Joining me now in the studio is the ABC's Chief Business Correspondent, Ian Verinder, Barrenjoey's Chief Economist, Joe Masters, and former Treasury researcher, now economist with the E61 Institute and the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute, Lachlan Bass. Welcome to you all. Firstly, to you, Ian, is this a budget with something for everyone, with one eye on the Reserve Bank and the other on the election?
Well, absolutely. And, what a difference a couple of weeks makes. Back in early March, we had several rate cuts penciled in, we had inflation beaten, and now suddenly you've got inflation with a second wind, possibly no rate cuts, so it leaves the Treasurer with very little options. Spend too much and you fire up inflation, don't spend enough and the economy could tip over.
Joe, inflation, is the energy bill relief going to add to demand in the economy and nudge inflation higher?
Well, technically it will lower measured CPI, which is what we've heard from the Treasurer tonight. So that is true and that will happen. But as you said, it is not putting cash into households' bank accounts, but they'll spend a bit less on their electricity. Now, it's less inflationary than if we put cash directly into household bank accounts, the cash splash. For many households, they will use it to spend on essential goods and services. For many mortgage holders, they will use it to put in their offset account. Despite the fact that people are struggling to make ends meet, what we're seeing at the moment with high interest rates is those with offset accounts are really prioritising trying to save.
Lachlan, what's your view on this? If, as the government maintains, subsidies are so effective in mechanically decreasing inflation, why isn't the government doing more of it?
It's a really great question, Kirsten, and I think at the end of the day, it's the RBA governor who's going to be the final adjudicator. But if we take a step back, if this was an effective way to decrease inflation, why not do it more so we can get back to the inflation target sooner? And I like to think about things in first principles. And so if its subsidies help us decrease inflation, then the question is, do taxes help increase inflation? And would we put a tax in if we're in a downturn, which just seems silly. So I think if you look at it on face value, I think it just comes across as not quite true.
Joe, could this tip the RBA's hand?
I think it's a really complex picture for the RBA. It was before. We've got a slowing economy and persistent inflation. Now we've got measures that technically lower CPI and probably the trimmed mean inflation, which is what the RBA targets. But we've also got a net, announced on the night, additional $9.3 billion worth of government spending in FY25 in an economy where demand is already too high for supply. So on balance, I think there isn't a smoking gun for the RBA to hike, but I think cuts are some time off, and it's probably at the margin made those a little harder.
Lachlan?
Yeah, and there's a $10 billion extra coming in the following year. And so if you look at the Treasurer Chalmers' Beach, he says they've banked 96% of the revenue upgrades to take the pressure off inflation, as you said in your interview with the Finance Minister. Next year, they're spending all of the upgrade and again. And so, the natural question is, obviously, that must be increasing inflation. And so I think it's definitely not a negative impact on inflation, and it's up to the RBA governor to make a decision on if it's a positive impact.
And yet household spending is exceptionally weak, which is a real weak point in the economy at the moment.
Yeah, but we're seeing government really step in, and so we've got a limited supply of goods and services in the economy, and the government's spending an extra $9.5 billion, $10 billion, and so for that given level of aggregate supply, we've now got more demand.
Ian, just say, as the markets are pricing in right now, that the RBA does indeed move rates higher. Is that a rise that the government now would have to own?
Well, probably, yeah. I mean, when you're the government, you've been in government for a full term, and there's a rate hike that's about to happen. As we've got very weak growth, which is not a great combination, they would have to own it, absolutely.
Now, household finances look set to improve just as national finances are expected to head the other way in time for an election.
Yeah, look, it's a great contradiction, isn't it? We've come out of a period where we've been racking up surpluses while households have been doing it extraordinarily tough. And now we're going to go into a period where household finances are going to recover because of an increase in real wages, a tax cut, possibly a rate cut, we don't know, but it happens at a time when the national finances are going back into deficit.
Lachlan, productivity was hardly mentioned by the Treasurer in his speech this evening. Does the budget do enough to improve the chances of productivity growth in both the short, medium and long terms?
Yeah, it's a great question. The budget covered a lot of waterfront today, and the one thing that was missing from my point of view was that laser-like focus on productivity that the Treasurer talks about. We previously thought productivity would grow at about 1.5%. Last year, the Treasurer downgraded that assumption to 1.2%. Our average in the last 5 years is 0.2%, so we're a long way away from that. And there's not a lot that I can see in the budget that's going to push us back towards the sort of levels of growth that we're assuming in the future. Some of the decarbonisation initiatives will help us with that transition, but away from that, we need to free up some of our resources like capital and labour to go to their best uses. And some of the actions we've seen outside of the budget process have seen increasing regulation in the labour market, making that harder and that transition harder.
OK, that is a terrific point to get some more reaction on the government's Future Made in Australia plan. We're going to go live to Perth now, where Rachel Papazzoni is ready to speak to some business leaders. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Kirsten. Joining me are Diane Smith-Gander. She's the chair of Zip and Cedar, as well as Elizabeth Gaines, who's an executive director with Fortescue. Elizabeth, I'll start with you because obviously a lot of the budget is focused on the energy space, and we saw $13.7 billion worth of production tax incentives for hydrogen and critical minerals processing. Is that enough to keep Australia competitive with the likes of the US and China?
Well, it's a really important statement that the government has made, that Australia is going to be part of the green energy transition. And what's really important about this is it means that capital that might have been deployed offshore because other countries were offering similar types of incentives will actually stay here in Australia. So it's $7 billion for the hydrogen production tax incentive. That's the estimated investment that's required. That will really provide those incentives that private industry need to invest in green hydrogen. And it's a really important message that we're going to be part of this global energy transition. And while $7 billion as a headline number may seem a pretty significant investment by the government, the multiplier effect of that on our economy, that'll make that seem like a very small amount, fractional, in terms of the investment in Australia, skilled labour, the impact on jobs. It's a really important message that Australia is going to be part of the global green energy transition. And as I said before, we'll make sure that that investment stays here in Australia, that it isn't diverted offshore.
Diane, what about businesses that aren't in the clean energy space? Was there enough in the budget for them? We saw an extension, for example, of the instant asset write-off. There'll be some energy relief for small businesses. Is there enough for those outside the sector?
Well, I think business in Australia is looking for tax reform, less regulation, but more importantly, access to skills. So things that are in the budget to help with housing. You can't employ a worker if there's nowhere for them to live. Those will be seen as very positive by business generally. And the real concern that we might see migration chopped off in a harsh way hasn't come to bear, and so that's positive.
Elizabeth, you mentioned that the announcements will attract investment here. Fortescue, of course, turned the sod on a $550 million hydrogen plant in the US this month. So is this that we've seen tonight enough to keep investment decisions like that onshore?
Well, I think, we need to see the details, but actually I think it will. I mean, we've also made 2 final investment decisions on projects here in Australia with the Gladstone electrolyser manufacturing facility and our green iron commercial trial plant at our Christmas Creek operations. So we have already taken final investment decision. The project in Arizona is just one of 3 projects that we achieved a final investment decision on last November. So we are very focused on investment here in Australia, and these incentives will go a long way to ensuring that those projects are economically viable, and from our perspective will stack up against offshore projects, so we make sure that that investment does stay here in Australia.
Diane, in your role with Zip, it's a company that in effect provides small loans to consumers. Are you seeing an impact in the behaviour of those customers? And do you think that the energy relief announced tonight has the potential to alter some of that behaviour and indeed be inflationary?
Australians are pretty good at managing their money. At Zip, we're seeing less than 0.2% of our, many millions of customers have to come to us for hardship assistance. So we know that they do trim their sails, but we also know that when people who are on lower incomes receive something that is a windfall, they are going to spend that. Now, they'll often spend it wisely. We saw in the past that rent arrears went down to historical lows. But if you take what's happening in state government, as well as what's happened with tonight's budget, there will be a lot of extra money in the hands of people, and they are going to spend it. This is a good budget for young Australians and for aspirational young Australians. I think it's fantastic that HECS and HELPS have been cut in their indexation, and that people who are getting their skills for the future are going to receive money for their prac. But that is all going to flow out into the economy. So I do think this balancing act of growth versus inflation is very real.
Elizabeth, the Future Made in Australia policy has been criticised by some as picking winners. Do you think it does that?
Well, I think there's what we've seen in the budget is that there is investment across a number of different areas. So it is about this green energy transition. So it's the hydrogen incentive, it's critical minerals, it's manufacturing of solar PV, there's the quantum computing. I think importantly there's the announcement on the mapping of resources across Australia. So I actually think it's pretty balanced. There's a lot in there in terms of not just picking one winner, but actually making sure that Australia remains competitive and can participate globally in this green energy transition.
Diane, finally, we've seen the government affirm its commitment to pay super on paid parental leave. Is that something that the corporate sector should be doing as well?
Well, the corporate sector, particularly at the larger end of town, is already doing that. It's clearly much harder for smaller businesses to be able to do that. But this is something that's super important in closing the gender pay gap.
What do you think about that, Elizabeth?
I couldn't agree more. I think hopefully the fact that the government has mandated that there's going to be this superannuation on paid parental leave, and that'll encourage smaller businesses as well, because as Diane said, larger businesses in Australia are already doing that.
Elizabeth Gaines and Diane Smith-Gander, so great to speak to both of you this evening. Kirsten, it's back to you in the studio.
Thanks, Rachel. Let's now drill down into the Future Made in Australia policy a little more with our expert panel. First to you, Ian. We've just heard the tick of approval from Fortescue. How do you view the government's guidance as to how it is directing its investment under this Act?
Well, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars here, and the vast bulk of that is being directed in the form of tax incentives. But there is a provision in this new proposal for the government to make direct investments into business. And we've seen that on a couple of occasions, or announcements that they're going to do that. Solar panels, quantum computing, a couple of mining investments. And that's a radical departure from where we've been for the past half a century. You know, since the 1970s, we've been involved in deregulation, privatisation, governments getting out of business. Now we're reversing that. But it is in keeping with what both America and Europe have been doing as well. So, you know, I guess we're keeping pace with the rest of the world.
Lachlan, do you agree? Is it radical? Does it focus on areas where Australia has a comparative advantage?
It's definitely a shift in the position of government and what we've seen in Australia, as Ian says. You know, I like to take a step back on a lot of these things. I'm more focused on productivity in general. So part of that is the decarbonisation of our economy. But also what we want to do is make sure that resources are going to their most efficient use. And so there's a range of other things we need to be doing to free up the markets to allow them to do that. And we just want to make sure that government isn't distorting those markets unnecessarily or too much.
Joe, what do you think about how the government is approaching this? It's relying very heavily on production tax credits to incentivise investment. It is similar to the US IRA. Are we competing?
We're absolutely competing, not just with the US, but with Europe, with China, with Japan, with South Korea. So, you know, from an economic perspective, I guess ideally you want the private sector to invest where they see a profitable and viable future. But the reality is when others around the world are supporting these industries, then we need to do the same. It's a bit of a race to the bottom. I think that use of tax incentives does get a tick from me. As you said, they use that in the US, and it's somewhat better than direct payments that we may also see, direct investments. What is most critical, though, is that we have a really keen eye on our comparative advantage and that government looks to share the risk with the private sector to allow the private sector to work out what does have that long-term sustainable future.
All right. Ian, just quickly, how does the $8 billion investment in green hydrogen square with the future gas strategy, which sees a major role for fossil fuel here in Australia past 2050?
Look, I think gas is absolutely essential for the transition because it's a much less polluting hydrocarbon than coal, and we do need a backup energy source or while we're developing energy storage via batteries. The one thing we do need though with gas is to sort out the East Coast gas market, which has been an absolute disaster, and we've seen gas prices here go higher than international prices with shortages right across the East Coast. That's got to be fixed.
Okay. Around 1 million small businesses will get energy rebates of around $325. They'll be able to take advantage of the $20,000 instant asset write-off too. That's been extended for another year. For reaction, let's head now to Sydney, where Alicia Barry is with the boss of the online platform Freight Exchange.
Well, hey, Kirsten, I've been actually hanging out with the staff at Direct Couriers at their Banks Meadow warehouse. They've been working late for us tonight so that I can talk to the founder of Freight Exchange, Kate Hull. Kate Hull, thanks for your time. We just heard a few measures for small business announced in that introduction from Kirsten there. And we also know that ACCI, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, says there's slim pickings in the budget for small business. What's your take?
Yeah, absolutely. Freight Exchange serves thousands of small businesses across the supply chain industry, and we are seeing the cost of living pressures really softening across many industries. And so, yeah, it would have been nice to see some more short-term measures. But however, if they, put more pockets, put more money in spending, then that's definitely a good thing for businesses all over Australia.
And when it comes to more long-term measures, I mean, we're standing in this big warehouse, the pallets are full of boxes, but it's very likely that not much, if any, it has products that are made in Australia. How do you think the Made in Australia plan could affect the freight and manufacturing sector that you're in?
I mean, it's going to be, it's fantastic to see the government investing in green and renewable energies and playing very much to our strengths. We rely on blue-collar workers and the education of those workers to be, being able to maintain and change industry. And so that's a really exciting, lot of investment in that space, and it's really positive for supply chains. Probably not in the short term, but certainly it's fantastic to see that we're embracing the opportunity now to become a smarter, greener country.
And in the short term, I mean, we did hear the instant asset write-off being extended. We also heard the energy relief. Is there some other things that you would have liked to have seen?
Well, certainly. So I think those things all help to put money in people's pockets so they're going to spend with businesses, and that's always a positive. I would say make sure you spend your $20,000 in business and get them shipped out and transported through clean, green transportation platforms.
Kate Hull, thanks so much for your time.
No problems. Thanks, Alicia. Thanks for having me.
So some big plans from the federal government and big hopes from small business that they'll eventually flow through. Kirsten.
Thanks, Alicia. We have just enough time for some final thoughts. Joe Masters, how keen do you think small business would have been to see some more incentives in tonight's budget? We know they've been doing it tough.
They have been doing it tough, and they are the backbone of Australia. They are the biggest employer in our country, and they're really important for innovation and for productivity. So what we've got, I think the electricity will be helpful, particularly for the services side of the economy. The extension of the instant asset write-off, not so much, because the more that you extend it, the less benefit that you get from it. One of the issues, I think, for small business at the moment is the difficulty of accessing credit and the cost of that credit. But what we know is a lot of innovation comes from small businesses run by young Australians, and if they don't own a home, they struggle to get unsecured lending, and I think that's a real issue that we need to address at some point.
Lachlan, you spent some time in the lockup looking for some information on foreign students. We know the government is looking at their numbers. Did you find what you were looking for?
Yeah, so from small business to big business, the universities, no, there was not a lot of information on the announced caps that we heard about on Saturday. And so I suppose we don't know what they're going to look like and how it's going to affect the economy and the international student market, but a word of caution, it is one of our biggest exports. It's something that is low carbon, majority female employing and a comparative advantage, something we've talked about tonight. And so I'd just caution the government to be very careful in interfering in that market.
Okay, Lachlan Vass, Joe Masters, thank you very much. Ian, we've run out of time for final thoughts, but I look forward to your column in the morning. Thank you to all of our panel. A special thank you to Joe Masters. She spent her birthday with us in the lockup and in the studio this evening. Thank you to you two for watching. We will have more analysis and reaction to the federal budget on tomorrow's program. Good night.